Scotland is known for its beauty, but hidden behind the postcard image is a trail of crimes that are so disturbing that they still shock the world today. Crimes that began in ordinary places, carried out by people no one suspected, ending in a horror that communities will never erase. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on some of Scotland's darkest crimes, acts of cruelty, mystery, and pure terror. These aren't stories for the faint-hearted. These are the cases that Scotland will never outrun. Life is honestly testing me so hard these days because I filmed this video last night. Saturday night I spent 2.5 hours filming this video only to find that I had somehow recorded without sound. So we're back again. Let's just get into it before I rant. So the Barrowland Ballroom, or as it's now referred to as just the Barrowlands or the Barras, was built in 1934 and it was actually named after the Barrowland Market in Glasgow. Does that look crazy? Now the building was completely rebuilt from the ground up after it was destroyed in a fire in 1958, and then it reopened on the 24th of December 1960. So quite a quick turnaround for like a building being burnt down then built back up. Love that. Now the Barras, as we call it these days, is a very popular venue in Glasgow. A lot of bands will play there. My dad has been to the Barras like countless amounts of times to see punk bands, and it's a very, very popular place. But back in the day, it was the Barrowland Ballroom, and within the Barrowlands back then, they would have like dances on like a Thursday and a Saturday night that was for over 25s. Usually it was married people that would attend these venues. These over 25 nights were actually referred to as Grab a Granny Night. Because they were over 25, they were considered grannies. I'm now 26, so I would be part of Grab a Granny. Love that for me. So, bit of a tangent there, I do apologise, but this was a very, very popular spot, like back in the 1960s. This is where everyone would go. And this is also where Bible John would find his victims. So on the 23rd of February 1968, the naked body of 25-year-old nurse Patricia Docker was found in the doorway of a lock-up garage by a man who was on his way to work in Carmichael in Glasgow. And I always think what's absolutely devastating in this case is her body was found only yards from her home in Langside Place. And I always hate hearing things like this because it's like, has she been tormented on her way home and then murdered, or has she almost got home and someone just came out and attacked her? It's just horrible to think of, almost being home and then just being killed. Now, they said it was very evident that Patricia had suffered from extensive blunt force trauma, especially to her face and her head in general, that had been brutally attacked. The police also said that it looks as though she had been strangled to death with a really strong ligature, which they believed at this point might have been a belt. Patricia's handbag, her watch and her clothes were missing from the scene. Her clothes would never actually be recovered, but her handbag was recovered from the River Cart when the police had sent down like an underwater investigation unit, and then her watch was found in like a pool of water that was close by the murder scene. Now, when police started to conduct like door-to-door inquiries, a witness had said that the night before Patricia was found, they had heard female screams, like blood-curdling screams that were screaming, "Leave me alone." But they never reported this. I think they were assuming that it's maybe someone who's drunk, who's just like acting up. But regardless, like if you ever hear screams like that, please, please, please go to your window, look out, see if you can see anything, go to your front door, have a look. And if you are worried, please phone the police because it could save somebody's life. Not blaming this person here because I totally get that you don't think that someone's going to be murdered right outside, but I think these days we just have to be so vigilant. Now, the ambulanceman on the scene who came to retrieve Patricia's body, he actually recognised her. Of course, she was a nurse, and he was able to say that she worked at the Mearnskirk Hospital. And unfortunately, Patricia's dad would have to come in the very next day to identify his daughter and confirm that it was her. And honestly, I cannot imagine having to do this, having to identify a loved one that you know has been brutally murdered, and especially the fact that she was beaten so badly to her face and her head. He's had to look at that and imagine what's happened to his daughter, and it just makes me feel sick. Now, the post-mortem that was conducted basically concluded that Patricia's cause of death was strangulation by a strong ligature. It was also said that Patricia's body showed no real signs of sexual assault. The stage of rigor mortis in her body, they believed that she had died just very shortly after leaving the Barrowland Ballroom. So between the Barrowland Ballroom and her trying to get home, there was a very short time frame in which she was murdered. So at this point, police believe that the killer has grabbed Patricia and repeatedly punched and kicked her in the face, which made her scream, "Leave me alone." Twice, by the way. This was screamed twice by this female, "Leave me alone." Police believe that they had then went on to strangle her to death, and then they ran away and left her body with nothing but a shoe nearby. They had stripped her of all her belongings, all her clothes, and just left her there for everyone to see. Then on Saturday the 16th of August 1969, a 31-year-old mother of three, Jemima MacDonald, had attended the Barrowland Ballroom. She was quite a regular at the Barrowlands. Like, people who went often knew of Jemima. She loved to go there and have a good time, have a drink, have a dance, have a laugh. So she was quite well known at the Barrowland Ballroom. And close to midnight, she had been seen in the company of a young man who was said to be well-dressed and well-spoken. He had short brown hair with light streaks and was said to be between either 6 foot to 6'2". Now, it was said that it was likely that he spoke with a Glaswegian accent. They thought it was likely that he could be from the area. And it was said that he would always insert biblical quotations whenever he was speaking to someone. He found a way to work in the Bible. Then Jemima was seen leaving the Barrowland Ballroom just after midnight, so now it's like the early hours of the 17th of August, and she was seen leaving with this man. Now, she was last seen walking either towards the main street or Landrecy Street, which was actually in the direction of her home. Now, it gets to about 12:40 a.m, so 20 to 1 in the morning, where Margaret O'Brien, Jemima's sister, she's currently watching Jemima's children, and she is becoming very concerned when Jemima hasn't returned home. But she's thinking, you know, maybe she's stayed at a friend's, maybe she's wanted just to continue the party, have a night off being a mum, just enjoy herself. So she gives her the benefit of the doubt. Now, later that day, Margaret O'Brien was growing even more concerned. She still hadn't heard from Jemima, and there was talks from young children within the village had been at like this abandoned derelict house in McKeith Street, and apparently they had been talking about a body being inside the derelict house. This, like, do you know that way when you get a gut feeling? It's like that feeling in your stomach and in your chest where you're like, something is not right. But again, Margaret wanted to believe that her sister was okay and she was probably just with a friend. Now, come the Monday, Jemima's sister Margaret has still not heard from her, and she is just like distraught and beside herself at this point. So she decides herself that she is going to go to this derelict building in McKeith Street and just check to see if it was all just rumours about a body lying in there. When Margaret walks into this derelict building, I don't think anything would prepare her for what she would find. She found the battered body of her sister lying face down with her shoes and her stockings lying next to her. Now, a post-mortem would conclude that Jemima had been brutally raped and brutally beaten, especially around her face and her head, and then she had been strangled to death with one of her own stockings. Now, they were also able to conclude that Jemima's murder had taken place around 30 hours before her body was discovered, so shortly after leaving the Barrowland Ballroom. Now, unlike Patricia Docker's body, Jemima was fully clothed, but her underwear had been torn, assuming for the rape to occur. However, just like Patricia, Jemima had been on her period at the time of her murder. Now, police inquiries into the murder of Jemima did provide several eyewitnesses that were able to accurately describe the man that Jemima had been seen with at the Barrowland Ballroom. They also done door-to-door inquiries in McKeith Street as well, and people did confirm that yet again they had heard female screams. Now, despite hearing these female screams, no one was able to conclude an exact time that they had heard these, but they did say that they definitely heard it on the night that Jemima was said to be murdered. Now, what's crazy is despite all the countless similarities in this case, the women were beaten, then strangled. They both attended the Barrowland Ballroom and they had both been on their period at the time of their murder. Police did not have a single thought of, this might be linked. Not once. They didn't even think about putting two and two together. They thought it was not possible that this was the work of the same killer, and they assumed that this was completely unrelated cases. And the case of Patricia Docker went cold very, very quick, and police would say this was due to lack of eyewitnesses and the lack of any hard evidence. But people also said that the police investigation was hindered because the police didn't even realise that Patricia had been to the Barrowland Ballroom until 3 days after her murder had occurred. And it wasn't until 18 months after the body of Jemima MacDonald had been found that police started to think, they might be related, but no. They just still could not conclusively link them together. And I get maybe not conclusively, but at least look into it as a possibility. Now, despite what they had thought earlier into the investigation when Patricia had not long been murdered, at this point they're starting to doubt whether or not this man was a local to the area or simply just someone who would travel to this area to commit the crimes, if it was the same person. And this would actually be the first time in a Scottish manhunt where police would give a composite sketch to the press to distribute via televisions and newspapers in order to help identify a suspect. Now, both male and female undercover police would attend the Barrowland Ballroom in an effort to try and identify a suspect or just see if anyone looks suspicious. However, by October 1969, they were like, this isn't working, let's just stop it. So they halted that, they just stopped it. Now, I was thinking, if I was a murderer, which I'm not, but if I was, would I not notice people who look shady and are looking and examining everyone in the ballroom? The thing is, undercover police are great and some are really, really amazing at what they do, but there is cases where they make it too obvious that they're undercover and that they're looking for someone in particular. These people would be watching everyone's every move, so as a murderer, you're probably going to pick up on that. And I genuinely believe that Bible John knew for a fact that the undercover police were there, because the minute that these undercover police stopped going to the Barrowland Ballroom, on the 31st of October 1969, another body would turn up. So a man was walking his dog when he then discovered the body of 29-year-old Helen Pittock behind a tenement in the Scotstoun district of Glasgow. And her body was found next to a drain pipe in the back garden of her Errol Street flat. Again, this woman had nearly made it home and was murdered right on her property. It's like he's just waiting to strike. These women are having hope of getting home and then he's taking it away. Helen was partially naked. She had been brutally beaten, especially to her face and head. She had then been raped and strangled to death. And just like the other case, she had been strangled with one of her own stockings. Now, Helen's handbag again was missing, but the contents of her handbag were scattered nearby her body. Helen also had grass stains on the soles of her feet, which the police believed was a struggle that had taken place. When Helen's being strangled, she's possibly been kicking along the ground to try and get some breath by relieving his grip. But unfortunately, she wouldn't get away, or potentially she was trying to run away and then he grabbed her again. But it's so awful. People being murdered anyway is just terrible, but it's that struggle to fight for their life and then dying anyway. It's just I think that's just so sad. It's just, It was also said that Helen had a very, very deep bite mark on her upper right thigh, and just as the same with Jemima and Patricia, She was also on her period at the time of her death, but Bible John had taken her sanitary pad and placed it under her left arm. Why? Why? Now, the night before Helen's murder, Helen had attended the Barrowland Ballroom, shock horror, with her sister Jean. And both Helen and Jean, they were speaking to two men. And weirdly enough, both of them were called John. One of them said that he worked as a slater and lived in Castlemilk. The other one was well-spoken, a bit more reserved, and he actually never stated where he lived. Now, the four of them were together for about an hour before they all decided to leave. They all left at the same time, and Jean's dance partner, he had walked toward George Square to board a bus. So he headed home on the bus, whilst Jean, Helen and the other John, they decided to get in a taxi together. So they set off from Glasgow Cross and they make the 20-minute journey toward Jean's home. I assume that Jean lived closer, so it was easier to go her way, then pass by Helen's after. Now, it was during this taxi journey where the most important evidence relating to Bible John's psychological profile would become apparent. So once they arrive at Jean's home, Jean gets out of the taxi and then Helen and the other John head toward Helen's home in Scotstoun. So Jean had later told the police that Helen's dance partner was someone who didn't drink, he was quite against alcohol, and he would also insert quotations from the Old Testament. Now, if you watch my videos, right, do you know who it was that used to love to read from the Old Testament to our children? I'll give you a second. If you guessed Ed Gein's mother, you would be right. He would also refer to the Barrowland Ballroom as an adulterous den iniquity. So, like I was saying, the nights that he would murder would be over 25's night, which I said was likely to be a bunch of married people who may very well be estranged from their husbands or just looking to blow off some steam. In Bible John's mind, did he think that these women were going there solely to cheat and that's why he would target them? Bible John would also state that he strongly disapproved of any women going to the Barrowland premises when they were married. Oh no, if Bible John says we can't, we shouldn't. Idiot. Now, Helen exited a taxi at Kelso Street and she watched as the taxi turned toward Errol Street. Now, Jean had described Bible John as a slim, tall, well-dressed individual who was wearing a well-cut brown Reed and Taylor suit. She also stated that he smoked Embassy cigarettes, and I kind of wish that I googled what they are. Like, are they kind of like a prestige cigarette, if you get them? She also recalled that Bible John had said that he was familiar with a lot of drinking premises within the Yoker district, so police were like, could this be a local who knows the area really well, or is he someone who maybe moved into that area? Like, you know, how does he know this? Apparently Bible John had also mentioned that he worked in a laboratory, but he never mentioned what he had done or where this was, so they didn't really have anything to go on with this. Jean was also able to provide like really distinct features that Bible John had, and one of that was his overlapping teeth. That was a very prominent, distinct feature that Bible John had. So Helen's given this description to the police, bearing in mind she spent a lot of time in the taxi and in the Barrowland Ballroom with Bible John, but the bouncers go ahead and disagree with Helen's description. They say that this man was short, he was well spoken, but he had black hair, not the brown hair with the light streaks. Now, the last possible sighting of the suspect was made by a driver and conductor of a night bus. Now, they had actually seen a young man matching Jean's description to a T. They said that this man looked very dishevelled. He had like mud stains all over him as if he had been like in a fight or participating in a murder. And they also said that he had a red mark on his cheek below one of his eyes, which they thought looked like a big cut. He was seen exiting a bus at the junction of Dumbarton Road and Grey Street. And this was around 2 a.m. on the 31st of October. Now, they also said that he was fidgeting quite a bit, and from what it looked like, he was tucking like a short cuff of one of his sleeves into the sleeve of his jacket. Now, what's important to note here is that when Helen's body was found, a man's cufflink was found beside her body. This has got to be our guy. The man was also seen walking towards a public ferry to cross the River Clyde to get to the south side of the city. So finally, like, a light bulb goes off in one of the police officers' heads and they're like, wow, wait, these must be linked. And now police were starting to believe that the murders might have occurred because the woman might have refused to have sex with Bible John due to them being on their period. But like, what's the chances that he picks up 3 women on their period? You know? Now, within hours of discovering Helen's body, the police drew up another composite sketch using the details given by her sister Jean. Now, Jean believed that the sketch that was drawn up after the murder of Jemima MacDonald actually represented great likeness to the person who she was detailing. So their drawings were going to look very similar. Now, the suspect at this time, with the hair that was described, it was unfashionably short for that era of time. So not only are we looking for a sadistic, horrible, sicko, murderer, awful person, but we're also looking for someone who doesn't have a great sense of fashion. Now, because the hair was quite unusual for that era, they had asked 450 hairdressers in and around Glasgow if they had given this man this haircut. And the hairdressers were like, no, absolutely not. And like, let's be honest, a guy like Bible John, he's probably cutting his own hair, or his mother is still cutting his own hair. Now, dentists in and around the city of Glasgow as well were also given the sketch and also the details regarding his teeth. They were asked to examine their medical records and see if they had anyone on file whose teeth matched the description of Bible John's. So they were looking for someone who had overlapping incisors and also a tooth missing on the upper right jaw. But again, no leads. This led nowhere. So we've got a guy with a really bad haircut and probably really bad breath, because it seems like he does not go to the dentist. Then, in June of 1970, police employed a photo fit system, which they hoped by using this would give them even better likeness for the suspect. And this was, again, was the first time in Scottish criminal history where they used this method to try and identify a suspect. It's crazy. It's Bible John's case really just up the ante for the Scottish police. More than 100 detectives would be assigned to this case on a full-time basis. There was over 50,000 witness statements that they had taken, and within the first year alone there was at least 5,000 suspects questioned. Now, Helen's sister Jean, she would have to attend over 300 identity parades to try and work out if the suspect was in any of them. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to identify Bible John from the suspects that they had brought in. Now, at this point, the police did begin to frequent the Barrowland Ballroom again on the Thursday and Saturday over 25 nights, just to see if by any chance they could find a suspect. Despite such an extravagant manhunt, nothing would turn up, and 3 of these cases for these women would turn cold. Because the cases had turned cold, the police believed that maybe the man wasn't local to the area anymore, maybe he had moved away, been institutionalised, been arrested, or maybe joined the armed forces. So they began circulating the composite sketch everywhere, TV, newspapers, all over the country, and still nothing turned up. Now, several criminologists and investigators had believed that the work of Bible John could have actually been by serial killer Peter Tobin. If you know about him, then you know how sadistic this man was. If you don't, I might actually cover him in a later case if you want another Scottish case, but I feel like I'm doing too many right now. Let me know in the comments. But they believed it could have been the work of him. Now, Peter Tobin was convicted in 2007 of a 2006 murder of a Polish student by the name of Angelika Cleek. She had been raped, brutally beaten and stabbed to death. Now, one of the biggest discrepancies that investigators found when looking at Peter Tobin as a possible suspect was the fact that Bible John would leave his victims in public to be found, whereas Peter Tobin buried all of his known victims. Now, I should tell you that this is the theory time, okay? So Peter Tobin was one of the theories, and I will tell you the rest, but just a few other details on the Peter Tobin theory. Police had initiated this operation. It was called Operation Anagram, and it was originally initiated in 2006. Now, what police planned to do in Operation Anagram was basically go over all of Peter Tobin's known whereabouts and track his steps throughout the decades to see if the timeline of the Bible John murders would match up with where Peter Tobin was at that point in time. Now, a woman did tell investigators that she had been raped by Peter Tobin after meeting him in the Barrowland Ballroom in 1968. This was shortly after the first murders were committed by Bible John. However, Tobin was eliminated as a suspect from the Bible John case because when they were tracking his steps throughout the decades, they noticed that when the final two murders of Bible John had occurred, that Peter Tobin was currently in Brighton at that point, so it couldn't be him. One of the former investigators by the name of Les Brown, he believed that Bible John could have been a man that he had arrested back in 1969, very briefly. Now, he did have a great likeness to the composite sketch of Bible John, but the one thing that shut down his suspicions was the fact that he never had overlapping teeth, this man that he was suspecting. Now, in 2005, Les Brown would write an autobiography and detail his suspicions of John White. However, the man John White would then come forward and offer his DNA sample. So his DNA sample was compared against the semen sample taken from the scene of Helen Pittock's murder, and he was completely ruled out. It wasn't a match, so this man was cleared. Now, in 1983, a man by the name of Harry Wiley had contacted the Strathclyde police, and he said that he believed his friend was Bible John. He said that his friend had extreme likeness to Bible John. They had both attended the Barrowland ballrooms back in the day when these murders were happening. He never really gave many reasons as to why he thought 100% that his friend was Bible John, apart from that he had read a news article and he just believed his friend matched the description. So police tracked down this man, and it turns out that he has moved to the Netherlands, he's married to a Dutch woman, and that was as far as their queries went. They never investigated any further. Now, years after the Bible John killings, loads of women, well, several women had came forward and said that they had been assaulted by Bible John after a night at the Barrowland Ballroom. One of these women were Hannah Martin, who said she had been raped by Bible John after a night at the Barrowlands with him in 1969. Hannah Martin even went as far to claim that she had given birth to Bible John's child in the January of 1970. What? But like, if she thinks that this was Bible John, why hasn't she offered up DNA sampling to, see if there is a match? In 1996, Strathclyde police had exhumed the body of a John McInnes from Stonehouse Graveyard in Lanarkshire. Now, McInnes had served in the Scots Guards and he had died by suicide in 1980 at the age of 41. Now, he was a cousin of one of the original suspects in the Bible John case, and he was also related to a senior police officer. So a DNA sample was taken from McInnes to compare with the semen sample found on Helen Pittock's stockings, or the stockings that had been used to strangle Helen. Now, the DNA test did come back inconclusive at this point. And then due to insufficient evidence in the inconclusive DNA test, he was ruled out as a suspect as well, and his name was cleared. Now, I'm going to tell you my theory, right? And this is purely just my theory, my opinions. None of this is actual fact, just what I believe could be possible. Possible, okay? I think it might have been a police cover-up. Right? I think it might have been a police cover-up. I think a policeman might have been Bible John, and here's why. The undercover detectives were in the Barrowland Ballroom, during the murders, trying to see if they could scope out a suspect. So during this time, if Bible John was within the police force, he knows that this is going on. So he's not going to frequent the Barrowland Ballroom at the risk of being caught, right? However, once the police sort of undercover investigation ceases, suddenly Bible John strikes again. Now, if he was in the police, he would know that the police investigation had ceased and that he could go back to committing these killings. I think that is pretty concrete, guys. I think that could be a possibility. A police cover-up, a policeman was Bible John. Like, I'm just saying, right? I feel that's quite a good one. Now, no further victims in Scotland or around the United Kingdom have been linked to Bible John after the 3 murders of these young women. And this manhunt for a murderer was one of the most extensive manhunts in Scottish criminal history, and was the first time that they had utilised methods that they had never used before. Now, police did say that the 18-month gap between the first and second murder is very unusual for a serial killer, so they even speculated that possibly the last 2 killings were by a copycat killer. And at the time, police did actually face a bit of backlash because they had jumped to conclusions by assuming that the killings were done by the same person, but in my opinion, I feel like that wasn't linked soon enough. Now, in 2004, police did announce their intention to genetically test a number of men in hopes of identifying the perpetrator, who was Bible John. So with this, they would request a blood sample from these concerned men, and they were hoping to get a genetic match between their DNA and the semen sample. Now, they were able to get an 80% DNA match from one of the men who they conducted this genetic test on. So they figured that this man could be related to Bible John. With an 80% match, that means that he himself is not the suspect, but a possible relative very well could be. Now, the sole witness to ever have a conversation with Bible John and sit within Bible John's company, Jean, Helen's sister, she unfortunately died at the age of 74 in 2010. Now, the composite sketch that Jean had provided back in the day with the details that she was able to give still remains as the most likely to be Bible John. That's the one that's still used to try and identify him, because the case does remain open till this day. I will also say as well, when Jean had heard the rumours that Peter Tobin could possibly have been Bible John, she shut this down and dismissed this immediately, because being in his company, she knew for a fine fact that Peter Tobin was not Bible John. That's not who she spent that night with. So to be honest, the reason that I'm doing this case is one night I was in the mood for a cannibal film, right? I love horror films. If you know me, you know. If you've been here a while, then you know. I love horror films, and usually the cannibal ones aren't always my fave, but there is a few good ones out there, right? So I was like, I'm going to watch The Hills Have Eyes 2. The Hills Have Eyes 2 is a brutal watch, but very much has you on the edge of your seat. So I'm watching The Hills Have Eyes, and when it was getting really brutal, I was like, who the hell comes up with these films? So I googled, Wes Craven came up with the original The Hills Have Eyes. And then I was like, what inspires this though? Because like, this can't be true. This like cannibal, incest, mutant thing cannot be true. And then I was shocked to make the discovery that The Hills Have Eyes is based on a Scottish clan of a family who was incest and cannibals, and they terrorised the people of Scotland. And they lived in a cave. So I was like, I need to cover this. So today we're going to be covering the case of Alexander Sawney Bean and his cannibal family. So let's go. So Alexander Sawney Bean was said to be like the head leader of a 45-member clan in Scotland throughout the 16th century. If you hear 16th century and you're thinking, not my cup of tea, I want true crime, modern day, stay tuned. I thought the same when I read this, but it is insane. Stick with me here. Now, they murdered and cannibalised over 1,000 people. 1,000 people, and for the most part, went undetected for the longest time. So Sawney Bean and his clan members, they would end up being caught after King James VI sent out like a search party looking for them, and every single one of them wound up being executed. So Alexander Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian. I cannot say 16th century. If I have to like enunciate it like that, ignore me. But Alexander Sawney Bean was born in the 16th century. Now, Bean's father was a ditch digger and a hedge trimmer. And like Sawney Bean did think about joining the family trade. He wanted to go into like the family business of trimming the hedges and digging the ditches. But he said that he just wasn't fit for this type of work. This type of work was just too much. And he felt like his expertise would be better elsewhere. elsewhere. So Bean's feeling a bit depressed because he feels like he's not joined the family business, he doesn't have his own business. What does he really have going for him apart from the sick thoughts that was going through his mind about cannibalising and murdering people? So he actually is able to find a woman who very much shares his depraved thoughts, feelings and urges. So great for him. And they decide that they're going to run away together. Now, this woman is described as vicious, aggressive, and just a disturbing human being all around. And she went by the name Black Agnes Douglas. Now, I believe Black Agnes was referred to as Black Agnes due to people believing that she was a witch and involved in black magic. It's called black magic. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but I couldn't really find any other reason, and just like doing 2 and 2, getting 4, getting Black Agnes, black magic. So that's what I think. So at first, Bean and Black Agnes, they are just happily going about robbing people. That's kind of the aim of the game. Like, Bean never had a trade, Black Agnes never had a trade apart from the black magic, I'm assuming, being a witch, getting up to witchy stuff, but because Bean never joined the family business, he never really had anything to fall back on. So they both decide that work's just no for them, and the best way to get some money is robbing people and terrorising them. But robbing people got boring really, really quick because Black Agnes and Bean just they weren't into that so much. I tinted my eyebrows earlier, but I don't think I had enough developer, so they've kind of went ginger. So again, with no money, you need a place to live, but like, if you've no money to buy a house, then what you gotta do? Well, Bean and Black Agnes, they decide to move into this gorgeous little coastal cave, right? It's idyllic, it's in this beautiful place, but what they would do would not be so beautiful and not really good for the economy. So this beautiful little cave that they would move into was in Benane Head between Girvan and Ballantrae. The cave was like 200 yards / 180 feet deep, and it was quite good for them because during high tide the entrance to the cave would be completely blocked off, so like no one would be able to see them or like get into their cave, which was very good when they were getting up to their criminal activities. Now, the other thing that was really perfect about this cave for Black Agnes and Bean was the fact that this big rock formation was equipped with loads of tunnels, loads of like secret little entrances in and out, and it spanned for like over a mile, which was like perfect for them. And then being this young happy couple, of course wanted to have a hideous family. Yeah. Hideous, like hideous to look at, like mutant, like it's given Bobo from Wrong Turn. So Black Agnes and Bean ended up having 6 daughters, 8 sons, and then they had 14 granddaughters and 18 grandsons. And if you're wondering, Anna, like, did the sons and daughters get girlfriends and boyfriends and then have babies? No. The brothers and sisters got together and made babies. Little mutant, ugly babies. Incest babies. Also, I don't know what it is, right? Why is it that these, like, big cannibal, mutant, hideous-looking families are so desperate to procreate? Like, it's hardly the genetic lottery. Why are we making so many of them? So they can take over. So at this point, Bean and Black Agnes, they have a lot of mouths to feed and they don't have any money. So in order to make ends meet, instead of going out and getting an honest job, Bean decides he's just gonna commit robbery and murder, because if he murders them, then there's no witness to say that they are robbing people. Nobody even knows that this cave is being lived in by this incestual cannibal family. Obviously, like I was saying, it's a big family, so Bean doesn't really feel like he can do everything himself. You know, he can't be that family man, that provider. He needs a bit of help, so he brings in the sons and daughters, he brings in the grandchildren, and they all start committing the crimes together. And I mean, maybe Bean just thought this would be his version of the new family business. Maybe this would be his trade that his children, his grandchildren, and his grandchildren's children could take on in the future. You know, keep the Bean name alive. Now, without any real sort of like life skills, business knowledge, how to start a business, you would think that Bean wouldn't be very good at organising stuff. But my God, could this guy build a trap, ambushes, like booby traps, the lot. He was very, very good at this. Too good, actually. So, Sawney Bean and his clan of inbreds, they would set up these traps, these ambushes, and they were targeting either like passersbyers, and they were targeting passerbyers who were either on their own or a small group. They would take on a small group, but not a large group. No, because you never know. The large group, they might be able to overpower them. So the Bean clan would rob these poor people, kidnap them, take them back to their cave, and then they would wind up brutally murdering them. Then once these people were murdered, the Beans would then dismember their bodies and proceed to cook and eat them. Yeah. And also, if there was any leftovers from the corpses, the Beans didn't believe in food waste. Absolutely not. So they would take the remaining bits from the bodies and they would pickle them and store them in jars. What is it with these like cannibal people? Like, they're always pickling stuff. Is this why we started having pickles and like pickled eggs and stuff? I don't think I'll ever eat a pickle again. Nah, I don't think so. They were pickling them in case they wanted a snack later, in case they got a bit hungry, a bit peckish. So once the Beans had felt like they had completely stripped the body of any meat or anything that they would like to eat from the bodies, they would then, with the dismembered body parts, they would discard of them in barrels, which worked out quite well for them because they would then just put the barrels into the water, which would then usually carry them to shore. So like, the body parts were washing up on beaches, and the local residents believed that animals were probably behind the attacks. But one thing I couldn't confirm, and this is what's annoying me, is were the barrels open so the body parts just like glided out of them and the body parts washed up on shore? Or were the barrels sealed and the barrels washed up on shore? Because like, if they think it's animals, how do they think these animals are packing up the barrels? Surely they must have been opened and then just the body parts floated up. Do you know? So after a while, the sheer volume of people who were going missing and then discarded body parts were turning up, the locals did start to think like, something's off. Something feels wrong. Something ain't right. They had no idea what it could be. And the thing is, with the Bean clan, they would be in their cave all day and then they would only come out at night. So the locals and like residents of that area weren't even aware just how close they could be living to the murderer, or in this case, murderers. When the Bean clan would come out at night, most people would have been in their homes anyway, but also it was so dark by the cave that you wouldn't even see them come out. So once the villagers became aware of just how many disappearances were going on, and then how many body parts were just randomly showing up once people went missing, they decided to like band together to find the culprits, because they didn't want anyone else in their community being hurt or like murdered by these people, you know? So they decide that they are going to go out, have a hunt, have a look about, and really they wanted to leave no stone unturned. Now, one of the search party members, they did take notice of the cave where the Beans resided, but they thought, that's impossible for like a person or persons to live in because it's a cave. How are you going to live in a cave? Little did they know. Little did they know. Now at this point, the villagers are getting very angry and very frustrated because they cannot locate the murderer or murderers, and more people are going missing and more body parts are appearing. So they just start pointing the finger at every Tom, Dick and Harry that walks by them on the street and assumes that they're the murderers. Now at this point, like I said, the people in the village are pointing fingers at every person that walks by them. This results in loads of innocent people being hung. Yeah, like, no evidence. They're just like, do you know what? It could be you. It could be you. Up to the gallows, let's go. They were just hanging everyone. Like, if you looked at someone the wrong way, you're being hung. You know? Like, if you accidentally kicked someone on your way by, you're being hung. It create like madness. And I believe that they were just hanging all of these people in the hopes that after at least one of them, the killings would stop. So I think they were just hanging until they got the right person. So the village, they continue to hang these innocent people, and the more people they hang, the more bodies are just turning up. All these discarded body parts are just washing up, regardless of how many people they've hung. So they're like, who could it be? So they started to direct their suspicions to like innkeepers and people like that, like in that sort of area of business, because they believe that they would be the ones who would see the travellers last. Now, and obviously, if the suspicion is switching over to you, you're going to want to run for your life. So many innkeepers were worried that because people were starting to believe it might be them, that they would then be hung. So loads of them just like abandoned their business. Like halfway through the day, they were like, nah, F this, I'm out of here. And they would just take off and leave their businesses abandoned. So this one day, there was like a local fair that had taken place, and the Bean clan, they'd ran out of food, their pickle jars were empty, so they were like, we need to go out and get some more resources. So they head out to see if there's anyone coming back from this fair late at night. So the Bean clan see a husband and a wife that are on horseback, and they decide, that's our next meal. Them right, perfect. Look at them, amazing. So they go to basically encircle this couple. So the Bean clan is swarming the couple and the horse. They start by ambushing them from behind, and they take the woman down immediately. As soon as they take this woman down, they begin gutting her while she's alive, like screaming. They begin gutting her and like gnashing on her insides. Now the husband, he's like shocked in pure horror what he's just seen happen to his wife, so he tries his best to escape the Bean clan. Luckily he still had the horse, so he was able to like jump over several of them, like the place that they were at, somehow he was able to jump over them. And luckily he had both a sword and a pistol on him, so he pulls those out as well. Now with the sword and the pistol, he does use them to fight off the Bean clan, and luckily he is released from their grip, so he's on the horse and speeds away. So then as this man's escaping on his horse, there's another 30 like fairgoers who are also leaving the fair. Now remember what I said, the Beans don't like to mess with larger groups. 30 is quite a big crowd. So they're approaching, the man's going toward them to obviously tell them what's happened. And then the Beans start to retreat back to their cave. But at this point, loads of people have seen them. So they've exposed where they live and the fact that they're the cannibalistic murderers that's terrorising the town. So luckily, obviously, like I was saying, the husband has escaped and he quickly makes his way back to Glasgow. When he gets to Glasgow, he's like, I need to tell someone what happened and what's been going on. So he actually goes directly to King James VI and he explains what happened to his wife in front of him and who these people are, where they live and where they hunt. And it was great because he was actually able to provide like the exact location where they lived. Like he could point out the exact cave where the Bean clan were staying. So hearing this news, King James VI, he gathers like a mob of 400 men and he himself leads this mob of 400 men directly to the Bean cave. How amazing, like taking action right away, I love that. These days you'd have to file like an instant report and wait a couple of years or wait until something happened to you. So love that from King James VI. So the King's bloodhounds, they basically led the charge to the Benane cave where the Beans were residing, and it is said that when they went inside, it was absolute carnage and chaos, like limbs just sitting around dangling, like they had tied up some body parts and stuff, so it was like kind of like decorated. It's given Ed Gein but more extreme. Also, I was looking in the cave, they found like a pile of loot. So the things that they had stolen, it was basically jewellery from the people who were going missing. So they could absolutely say 100% this Bean family were the murderers. Great. So there are two kind of separate possibilities of the story at this point, so I'm going to give you both and then we'll decide which ones we believe. So the most common believed one is that once the Bean clan were discovered, they gave themselves up without a fight. So it then says that they were taken to the Tolbooth jail in Edinburgh and then they were transferred either to Leith or Glasgow, and this is where they would all eventually be executed. Now, it said that the locals were so disgusted and angry with what the Bean clan had done, and they demanded that their punishment be more extreme and more brutally unbearable than just mere death. So because of this demand, 21 of the Bean women were burned alive, and then the Bean men were all dismembered and left to bleed out. Now, for Sawney Bean and some of the other men, they actually had their genitalia cut off and threw in a fire, and then their hands and feet were also severed and threw away, maybe into the fire, and then they were left to bleed out. Yeah. Now, apparently, Sawney Bean's last words were, "It isn't over, it will never be over," and it just makes me laugh because like it makes me think of Rambo First Blood when Rambo's like, "Nothing is over." That Sawney Bean, very dramatic. Then after watching the men die, like the women who were alive still had to watch what happened to the men, and then after that, Black Agnes, the other woman and the other female children, they were all tied to stakes and burned alive. And these punishments that the Beans received recalls the medieval like hanging, drawing and quartering of men who were convicted of treason. And then of course women who were convicted of the same would be burned alive. And then the second version of events that they sort of believed could have happened was the search party had detonated gunpowder at the entrance to the Bean cave and they all just choked and suffocated to death, which I really hope's not the case, because what Sawney Bean done to thousands of people, him and his clan, absolutely required the first punishment. And I believe back in that time, I reckon that's what happened. Now, there is also another element to this story which is absolutely crazy. So it said at one point, one of Bean's daughters had basically grown bored of being in the Bean clan, right? So she wanted to leave and she moved to the town of Girvan, which was near where all the murders and that took place. And apparently she planted this tree, and when she grew it, it was called the hairy tree. Must have looked hairy or something, I don't know. But apparently when the locals found out what the Bean clan had done to people, they uncovered her identity as well, and then they wound up hanging her from the hairy tree. Her own tree. They hung her. So just before I jump on in this case, which has been quite highly requested, especially in the last couple of months, I've really seen like an influx of people requesting this case, which I'm all for. I'm always here to cover any case regardless of the topic. But after researching this one online, I just feel the need to do this disclaimer. Also, just before I address that, let me address the fake tan that is fading on my hands. Very patchily, is that a word? If not, we're inventing it. I tanned because I met up with a friend last week and my skin is as dry as a lizard. I must be repelling fluid at this point because there is not a bit of quench on my skin right now. Anyway, know the point, Anna. Stop talking about yourself. So the case that I'm covering today, the case of Kriss Donald, as you will probably know if you know this case, the men who took his life, it was a gang of Pakistani men. Please remember that the monsters who we talk about in this video, they only represent themselves, okay? They do not represent their entire race, their entire culture. These men are monsters within themselves. Just because you have an evil person or an evil group from a specific race does not mean that that entire race should be tarred with the same brush. These monsters in the video, they will be getting slandered the way that I slander every other monster, but the hate, the comments that I've seen online projecting onto an entire race for something that 5 men did, I ain't having it. So on Sunday the 14th of March of 2004, there was a gang leader by the name of Imran Shahid. Now Imran, he was a terrible, terrible human being, to say the very least. An absolute vile monster. He was out at a nightclub, he's partying, he's drinking heavily. He was known to be someone who would go out his way to intimidate every single person around him. He thought he was bigger and stronger than anyone else. Yet he only picked on people smaller than him, younger than him, and this is a theme with this monster. Now Imran, he was known as Baldy. The man's given egghead. But he was known as Baldy because, well, he lacked in the hair department. But even if he had a wee bit of hair, even if he's got like a little bit of upper growth going on, my light just died. Spirits. But anyway, even when Baldy actually wasn't bald and he was sporting a little bit of growth up top, he was still getting called Baldy. And whenever he had like a little bit of regrowth, he would dye it bleach blonde. Just giving Slim Shady wannabe. And honestly, when he bleached it blonde, he still looked bald. So Baldy, he was a bodybuilder and he viewed himself as being the toughest man in Glasgow, Scotland. But, you know, why would the toughest man only have to pick on people younger and smaller than him? I don't know. So he thinks he's the big hard man of Glasgow, but honestly, he was actually the laughingstock of Glasgow. Everybody looked at him and just thought, you are ridiculous. You are a laughable, stupid, weaselly little human being. Now, whilst he was a laughingstock of Glasgow, I need to admit, he was a man that would go to any lengths just to prove how tough he could be, how scary he could become, and how no one should ever cross Baldy. I'm sorry, it's just like so unthreatening. Don't cross Baldy. Can't take it serious. I'll be crossing Baldy. So 29-year-old Baldy at this point, he had only been out of prison for 3 months because he was serving a 30-month sentence after a road rage attack on a 42-year-old woman who he tried to run over. Listen, I don't have context to the story and honestly I don't need any. Why are you trying to run a 42-year-old woman over? What did she do? And that was not the only thing in his criminal repertoire. I mean, this guy, he was known for being a physical assaulter. He would commit multiple physical assaults. This is almost what he was known for. He had drug offences, driving offences, and these physical assaults that he would commit on people, it wasn't just a punch here and a kick there. It was full-on assault to the point where he would render people... Why can't I say people? But he would render people, thank you Anna, he would render people helpless, completely. Beat them within an inch of their life. And one of these assaults that he had been charged for, it had been so severe and so deadly that he left his victim with permanent brain damage. And he was proud of this, Big Baldy. He loved this. He thought this made him the bee's boss. And as you know, because I've already said, and if you don't know then you weren't listening, but Imran, Baldy, bleach blonde Baldy, he would only target those younger, smaller, people who didn't have the same outward toughness that he had. They were his perfect victim. And this was because he knew if he took on these kinds of victims, he would always win. There was no chance that he could humiliate himself by being battered by one of these people. And that was important to him. Because this man, like we said, believes he is the toughest piece of shit in Glasgow. And let's be honest, it would not be good for Imran Baldy, bleach blonde Baldy's reputation if he had his ass handed to him by someone else. It probably comes as no surprise, but Imran Shahid, he was a member of a gang, and this gang was known for being notoriously dangerous. These men, they were absolutely ruthless. So Imran, he was the ringleader of a Pakistani gang. It was 5 of them, including Imran himself. Now, throughout the 1990s, specifically within the Pollock Shields area of Glasgow, There was a lot of tension, and this racial tension seemed to be between British gangs and Pakistani gangs. And it did seem to be something at this point that was so prevalent within the different neighbourhoods. So let's go back to Sunday the 14th of March. Imran, Big Baldy, he's out in the town. He's just wanting to live it up, and his idea of living it up is heavy drinking, drug use and intimidating those smaller and deemed weaker than him. So he's out, he's squaring up to people on the dance floor, and he would spot a group of men that he recognised to be the McCulloch Street Gang. Now the McCulloch Street Gang and Imran's gang, known as the Shielders, well, they never got along. They were very much rivals and they hated each other. So as soon as the McCulloch Street Gang, they see Imran and they start shouting abuse at him, okay? They are taunting him, they're humiliating him in front of people, and as we know, this is something that Imran just cannot stand for. And Imran at this point, he's getting himself in a bit of a tizzy because he is not happy that he has been called out and humiliated so publicly by a rival gang. He's getting a bit embarrassed, you know, so he's like, I need to strike back, strike first, strike hard, no mercy. And if you watch Cobra Kai, then you know. But if you watch Karate Kid, then you really know. So Baldy and these men, they approach each other, and as you can probably guess, an altercation breaks out, there's a bit of a fight going on, and this is when one of the McCulloch Street Gang, they take a glass bottle and they bottle him. So they hit Big Baldy over the head, cutting his head open, maybe a few scars, a few stitches might be needed, but no for Big Baldy because he's tough, he'll tough it out. But this leaves Baldy disorientated. He's like, oh my god, like what's going on? Once he gets his bearings and kind of like recovers from the disorientation, he tries to chase after these young men from the rival gang, but they run away, they hop in the car, they've got the windows down in this car, and they're still hurling abuse at this man, yet again humiliating him in public because everybody's staring. And Imran, Big Baldy, he's just standing there like, they call me names. And this whole altercation and what happened, this infuriated Imran. And he knew from that moment he needed to get revenge because other people around him had to be aware that you don't do that to Baldy, right? Baldy doesn't take crap. Baldy will find you and he will commit the most heinous, vicious revenge you could ever imagine. Now, it is very clear to me, just from what we've said so far, this man, he's quite clearly never had like a bad moment, took a deep breath, counted to 10, took a break, had a Kit Kat, relaxed to get over a situation. Because he just spends the rest of his night getting angrier and angrier and angrier. Like it's just building up. Who has time for that kind of negative energy? Big Baldy. And honestly, this guy, he would just stop at nothing to prove that he was not the guy to be messed with. And this would lead to one of the most horrifying and blood-curdling murders that we will ever discuss. So it's the next day, Monday the 15th of March 2004. Baldy, he calls like team meeting, guys, we need to talk. So he gets together the gang members. All 5 of them are like sitting around the campfire telling stories, and Baldy debriefs about the night before. You know, someone bottled him, how dare they, he's Baldy, big bad Baldy, no one messes with him. And listen, there's nothing wrong with confiding in your friends, telling them about the night before, bitching, whining, having a moan, that's absolutely fine. But this is not what he or that gang would do. Because the whole reason he was sitting down and debriefing these gang members was so they could formulate the perfect plan for revenge. Baldy and the rest of the gang, they were planning on hunting down this man who humiliated him and murdering them. So like I said, Baldy's gang, it's known as the Shielders. I don't know if that's because it was like the Pollock Shields area. Possibly, it would make sense. But this was made up of 5 gang members. So this of course includes Baldy. Then we have Mohammed Faisal Mushtaq. Now he was better known as Bex and he was 27 years old. So, you know, these are like fully grown men, or at least they should be. Then we have Baldy's brother, Zishan Shahid. He was known as Crazy. Crazy was his nickname. And I don't want to know why, but we're going to basically find out why. But yeah, Crazy, not the best name to be known for. Or I guess it is to them and their gang. Then we have 22-year-old Zahid Mohammed. He was better known as Ziggy. That was like his nickname within the group, which, you know, not as scary as Crazy. And then we also have 22-year-old Danish Saeed, and his nickname was Ferrari. I don't know, maybe he runs fast. And this group of men, they were known for operating in a mafia style way. Like, they used intimidation, they were violent, they would do whatever they had to do to prove a point. And they would utilise this intimidation and violence to ensure that they could maintain control of those around them. Specifically Baldy, being the leader of the group, he had to maintain control at all times. This is why this man could not afford to be humiliated in front of his gang members. He's got a rep to keep up. So Baldy and the gang, they are all sitting in Bexy's flat and they're basically doing a quick whip around. Does anyone know who it might have been from the McCulloch Street gang who attacked me last night? So they're going around in a circle. It could be this person, could be that person, could be that person. But ultimately, none of them know for sure who it could have been. So they decide they're going to make some business calls, some phone calls around, see if anyone else knows who it could be. But yet again, people were drawing a blank. People had no idea who it might have been that bottled him the night before. And still, with no luck, Baldy's rage is just growing and growing. It is oozing out of this man's pores. He just cannot contain it. And this is when Baldy tells his gang to grab a bag, fill it with tools, because they were going to go and hunt down the McCulloch Street gang so they could chop them up and take their eyes out. That was a lot of moving. I think I'll only need to do quote unquote. I don't know. But they wanted to go chop them up, take their eyes out. So within this bag, there was a hammer, there was a screwdriver, there was a sharpened knife, and just many other sharp, hard objects that could inflict torture on someone. So at this point, Baldy, he was sporting a bit of his like bleach blonde locks, you know, Slim Shady vibes. But he was like, you know what, people might recognise me with the blonde locks, so I better dye them back black, Kardashian style, so I can, you know, fly under the radar. He was hoping that by doing this, if they bumped into the McCulloch Street gang, none of them would recognise Baldy. But let's be honest, you could spot that ugly mug from a distance. So Bex, he was told to stay behind in the flat, keep the tools with him. The other 4 men, they got a taxi to the West End of Glasgow because they were going to pick up a stolen Mercedes. Classy, sophisticated. It would then be just after 3 p.m. that Bex gets a phone call, you know, grab the tools, we've got the Merc, we're heading back, we'll pick you up. And then the hunt begins. So the 5 men, they pile into the car, tools in hand, and this bag of tools at this point, we can just refer to that as the murder kit, because that's exactly why they had them. So Baldy, the 5 men, they're all in this car. Honestly, it's like a wee clown car at this point. How many people can they fit in? I don't know. But they are prowling the streets. They are looking everywhere, trying to identify members of the McCulloch Street team. And Baldy, he's getting impatient. He's growing angrier. The rage is filling up. His head is gonna explode. And this is when he orders the men to just look out for any white male they can find. So it wasn't about finding the man who bottled him the night before. At this point, it was just about what young white male he could get and commit his revenge on, because someone had to pay the price. So they're driving along, and at this point they're driving on Kenmure Street, and Baldy immediately spotted 2 young men walking down the street. He immediately orders the car to be stopped and he shouts out, "I'm doing them." He wanted these 2 young men who he didn't know, who weren't a member of any gang whatsoever. These 2 young men was 15-year-old Kriss Donald and 20-year-old Jamie Wallace. Now let me just say, sources say that Jamie was 19, some say it was 20, I don't know if he was 19 going on 20. My apologies if any of them are wrong. And horrifically, it would wind up being 15-year-old Kriss Donald who would become the victim of one of the most horrendous, chilling, heinous, evil, vicious murders I have ever heard of. And he had nothing to do with the attack on Baldy the night before. He didn't know Baldy, he didn't know Baldy's gang. He couldn't even go out uptown into clubs because he was only 15 years old. All this young boy cared about was spending time with his family, his friends, playing video games, and he was targeted simply because he was a white male walking down the street that day. So Kriss Donald, who was this incredible young boy? Well, Kriss Donald, he was born on July the 2nd of 1988 in Glasgow, Scotland. He was born to his mum Angela and also his father Alex. The couple did separate when Kriss was just a little toddler. Kriss, he would remain with his mother and his father had relocated to Portsmouth. And despite living in different places and having this distance between them, Chrissy's father always ensured that he kept in contact with his son and that his son knew how much he was loved. So like I said, Kriss, he would live with his mother Angela, his two sisters and his brother, and they lived in the Pollokshield area of Glasgow. Pollokshield at this point was a really diverse area. It had people from all walks of life who were living in that area. Kriss was brought up to treat everyone the same, treat everyone equally, to love everyone the same way. It didn't matter if they were rich, poor, what their gender was, what their race was, their culture. He just treated everyone as they should be treated, like equals. Now let me tell you, Kriss was a mummy's boy, okay? He was the centre of his mum's world, along with his siblings of course. But Kriss was just everything to his mum. He was described as being one of the most kind-hearted and caring people that you would ever know or ever get the chance to meet. He was an incredible brother, he was an incredible son, an incredible friend. He just lived for his friends and family. Oh, I'm getting upset already, and it's like, I'm not even into the case, but really, if you have time, you should totally, read up on Kriss, the kind of person he was, because it just sounds like he was an incredible human being and he was only 15, So much life left to live, so much left to give this world. And I just think he would have been such a blessing if he were still here. Now, Kriss, like every other teenager, he didn't really like school too much. If he could have a day off, he would absolutely have a day off because, let's be honest, who wouldn't occasionally sneak a day off school? But despite not loving school or, finding it the most interesting thing in the world, he maintained good grades. He was such a clever young boy. Learning almost came easy to him, so who cares if he misses a couple of classes? He's always going to catch up. Now, Kriss, he was described as being a really good kid. He never got in trouble. He never got involved in fights and arguments. He just wanted to live a quiet, happy life and just do the things that he enjoyed. He was just a young lad who loved to hang out with his friends, play video games, watch the football, support his favourite team, which was Rangers. Typical teenager behaviour. He's not going to nightclubs and causing fights. He's not getting involved with gang members. He's a typical young boy just living his life. Now, Kriss, he had really big aspirations for the future. I mean, there was a few different options that he thought, I could pursue this or I could pursue that. One of them was he thought about joining the army, and the other one was that he wanted to become a mechanic. Honestly, he could have done both. He could have achieved anything that he had put his mind to if only he was given the time. Now, when it came to Chrissy's friends, they just absolutely adored this boy. Let me tell you, everyone just had the nicest things to say about him. He was kind, he was caring, he was funny. He was a good person with a kind heart who just wanted the best for the people that he loved. And not only that, friends, family, teachers, everyone who knew Kriss said that he could be anything and do anything that he wanted to. He could achieve whatever he wanted in life. He had it all at his fingertips. And it is just absolutely soul destroying to think that this boy who could have done so much in his life was denied the chance by evil, sadistic monsters. So from Chrissy's perspective, it's Monday the 15th of March 2004. It's a school day. Kriss wakes up this morning and he's not feeling too good, or, he's not feeling 100%, and he asks his mum if he could please take the day off school. He's got a really sore throat, he just doesn't feel at his best, and he would just really like a day in the house to relax. Now his mum Angela, she's kind of thinking, a sore throat isn't really a reason to stay off school, but she was going through a bit of a tough time. She's got these children that she's looking after, and it wouldn't be the worst thing to maybe have a helping pair of hands around the house that day. So she says to Kriss, listen, you can have today off as long as you help me around the house. And Kriss is like, jackpot, you know, I've hit the lottery here, because fair enough, I'll help around the house if it means that I'm not going to school today. Later that day, and I'm sure every single one of us, or most of us, can absolutely relate to Kriss in this moment, suddenly he's feeling better, right? He's back to 100%. Kriss is feeling good. So he says this to his mum, you know, I'm feeling a lot better, conveniently once the school day has ended. And with this, he had asked his mum if he could go and meet up with a friend, play some video games, and also pick up a video game from his friend. Now, usually his mum would say, no, you've been off school. Angela wasn't entirely thrilled with the idea of Kriss going out, considering he had been off school that day, but on this occasion, she would allow it. This has kind of brought us full circle back to the moment when Baldy would spot these two young men and jump out the vehicle. So Kriss and Jamie at this point, they are just walking along Kenmure Road. They're having a laugh like boys do. They're talking about video games, what they're enjoying at the moment, what they're going to buy, any plans that they have coming up. And suddenly they would find themselves under a deadly, fatal ambush. So Baldy at this point, he has jumped out the car, out of the stolen Merc. The gang jumps out behind him. He's shouting and swearing at these young boys about the night before. Who do you think you are, bottling me? You're part of the McCulloch Street gang. Even though he knew these young men were not. Kriss at this point, he's 15 years old. He is fearful. This big man has jumped out his vehicle, accusing him of all sorts. He's telling the guy, listen, I have no idea what you're on about. I don't know who you are. I'm only 15, like I don't get into clubs. I definitely wasn't the one that attacked you last night. You've got the wrong guy. But Baldy was not listening. Because as we know, this evil POS was just out for blood. Now Jamie, obviously he's older and he knew of Baldy, but he wasn't associated with Baldy or any of the rival gangs. He just knew who this guy was. And this immediately made him terrified because he knew this guy would go to any length to prove a point. So these men, they are trying to grab Kriss, or grabbing at him, trying to haul him into the car, and his friend Jamie is desperately trying to fight back. He's punching, he's shouting, he's kicking, he's doing whatever he can, just trying to protect his friend. But 20-year-old Jamie, he could not fight off a group of 5 men. So they're forcing Kriss into the car at this point. Kriss is screaming, he's grabbing onto the door frame to try and prevent them from getting him into the vehicle. And he is shouting, begging and pleading with these men. He's saying, I'm only 15, what could I possibly have done? At this point, these horrific monsters are getting so pissed off with Kriss. He's causing a scene, he's fighting back. They hadn't planned for this. So they start brutally beating him, punching him to subdue him enough that they could get him into the vehicle. Jamie at this point is watching in complete terror. He's trying to intervene, he's trying to get his friend back. But Baldy turns around to him and he says, do you know what pain is? Because you're next. Threatening and terrifying Jamie. And just as quickly as this car pulled up, it took off again. This car filled with these 5 monsters and Kriss, they sped away. Jamie is frantic, he's hysterical at this point. He doesn't know what to do. He immediately runs back to his grandma's house. He's trying to get help. A neighbour had actually witnessed Kriss being forced into the car and driven away. And another neighbour had rushed to Chrissy's house to tell Angela exactly what had happened. And they immediately call the police. So Strathclyde Police in Glasgow, they take a statement from Jamie. And thankfully, because Jamie knew who Baldy was, he kind of recognised the gang that he was associated with, as well as the other statements that they had got from other witnesses like the neighbours, etc. The police knew who they were looking for. They knew that they were looking for Baldy and his 4 men. And thankfully again, with Jamie and with the witnesses, they also knew what car it was that they were trying to look for and just how many men were in this car. And with all this information, it makes for an easier search. But I don't think the police or the public could have predicted just how far these men were willing to travel to make sure they got away with this. But the police, they set up a very extensive search for this young boy. They are hoping and praying that they will be able to bring him home to his mum and his siblings. But time's running out. What would take place that day in the back of that car was a thing of nightmares. Something that we could only really witness in horror movies. Something that a 15-year-old, something that no one should go through, but a 15-year-old should absolutely never, ever, ever be in a position to experience anything like that. He is being attacked and tortured by these fully grown men who are known for their violence, who are known for being ruthless. And he's terrified. These men are telling Kriss, give us information, give us the name of the person who attacked Baldy last night. And Kriss has no information to give, and he tells them this, he tells them over and over and over, if I knew I would tell you, but I have no idea who you are or what happened to you. And I certainly don't know who attacked you, but I can tell you that it wasn't me. Kriss is begging and pleading with these monsters to just let him go. He has no information for them. He is no good for them. And Baldy, he just turns around, looks Kriss dead in the eye, and says, nobody f***s with Baldy. Baldy then shows Kriss this bag of tools that he's got, you know, the murder kit essentially. He threatens him with these, and he also states that there's a gun inside. And if Kriss disobeys or backchats or just talks, he will use it on him. At this point, the entire group in this car, they are phoning every Tom, Dick, Harry, Fran and Sally. They're trying to find somewhere where they can take Kriss back to torture information out of him. Information this 15-year-old does not have. They aimlessly drive for 200 miles to Dundee and back, just trying to find someone who can give them a house or give them a flat to go back to. But they're having no luck. No one has anywhere that they can go back to, and you'd hope and pray that they would just let Kriss go. But they had absolutely no intention whatsoever. Now remember Ziggy, one of the evil monsters there? Well, he actually had an ankle monitor, you know, like an electric bracelet around his ankle, and this had a curfew of 6 p.m. So if it was 6 p.m. and he wasn't back in his house, the police would then come to arrest him for breaching his bail conditions, basically. Now, why was he on bail? Well, he was on bail for carrying around a knife and threatening people with it. Yeah, the kind of monsters that you're dealing with. But he starts crying with Baldy. He's like, Baldy, I need to go home. I've got a 6 p.m. curfew. You know, Mummy's going to be mad. So Baldy says to Ziggy, fine, right, shut up, stop your whining. I'll take you back home, we'll get you back by your curfew, but we just need to stop and get petrol first, and also buy some extra petrol. So after they put petrol in the vehicle and also purchase this extra petrol, they drop Ziggy back home. He makes his curfew, hooray, good for him. Now Kriss is left in this vehicle with 4 evil men who cannot decide where to take this young boy. So they're thinking, they're pondering with each other, they're throwing out ideas. And one of them suggests taking Kriss to the Clyde Walkway. This is a nature trail, and around this time of the evening, around 7 p.m, it's quite quiet. So it's somewhere where they could go and Chrissy's screams would likely not be heard, and they could probably do whatever they want and not be caught. So they drive for a bit and they arrive at the Clyde Walkway, and this is where the most horrifying, nightmarish thing would happen. Kriss would be forced out of the car by these men. 2 men would be restraining his arms. Now, it was determined that his arms had been restrained because Kriss had no defensive wounds. He hadn't been given the opportunity to defend himself. This 15-year-old boy was brutally and viciously beaten by this gang of grown men. These gang members, known for their violence and known to be horrific evil monsters. After they've finished beating Kriss, they then take a knife, they stab him 13 times, which ends up severing 3 of his main arteries. It punctures a lung, his kidney, his intestines, and his stomach. These in themselves are life-ending injuries. This attack with the knife had been so brutal, so heinous and so vicious that it had cut one of Chrissy's ribs in half. And just when you think there is nothing more that they can possibly do to torture this young boy, surely they've done enough, They weren't finished with Kriss. The petrol that they had purchased at the gas station, they take that, they pour this over Kriss, who is completely defenceless at this point, and they set this young boy on fire. They set him alight whilst he is still alive. Kriss fought, and I mean he fought with every last bit of strength that he had. Every single fibre of his being, he tried his best. He tries his best to make his way down a grassy slope. The reason he was going down this slope was because at the bottom there was actually a riverbank. And he was thinking, you know, if I get to this riverbank, if I get myself in the river, I can extinguish the flames on myself. But he never made it. He would collapse toward the bottom of this grassy slope. This young boy starts rolling himself in mud to try and put out the flames. But Kriss would succumb to the injuries, the stab wounds, the burns, the severed arteries, the punctured organs, and he would die and be left in this mud. Now these men, they hadn't stayed behind to witness exactly what happened to Kriss. As soon as they set him alight, they sped off. They had no desire to stick around and see whether he lived or whether he died. Because let's be honest, these men knew what they had done to this boy was going to kill him. So the men, they drive this stolen Mercedes back into Glasgow into a lane and they abandon it. They set it alight, hoping that when it's found, there will be no DNA evidence or any forensic evidence that could link them to the crime or link this vehicle to being something involved in Chrissy's murder. That night, they had also burned every item of clothing they had worn for this attack. Next morning, on Tuesday the 16th of March 2004, Chrissy's burned and bloody body would be found by a passerby. Somebody out on a morning walk would discover Chrissy's charred, bloodied remains. Kriss had died from acute blood loss as well as his burns, and these burns covered 70% of this boy's body. He had been so badly burned that most of his clothes had disintegrated. There was partial remnants of his boxers and also one shoe on his foot. After Chrissy's body is discovered, the police have to notify the family, they have to notify Angela, his siblings, his father, and nothing can prepare a family for news like that. Not just that your child has died, which by the way, no parent should outlive their child. A child should always outlive their parent. It's just what's known. They have to deal with the death of their son, but they also have to deal with the knowledge that he was brutally murdered and that his final moments were spent in complete terror and pain. So this car that the idiotic gang had tried to get rid of, it was found pretty quickly. And although they thought they were smart, burning the car, burning the evidence, these investigators, they were still able to recover blood from that vehicle that was a direct match to Kriss Donald's blood. They would also get DNA evidence from a leather jacket that was left bundled up in the car, which had belonged to Baldy. This had Chrissy's DNA on it as well. And not only that, but they located Chrissy's other shoe. And it's just so pathetic and so laughable that these hard men, you know, these men that thought they were so hard and the toughest guys in Glasgow, none of them wanted to face the consequences of their evil actions. So much so that Big Baldy, the toughest guy in Glasgow, alongside his brother Crazy and Bex, they fled to Pakistan to evade capture. They knew that they could do this because there was no extradition treaty between Britain and Pakistan. So if they went there, Pakistan authorities did not have to hand them back. But because police knew who they were looking for, it wouldn't be too long before Ziggy and Ferrari, they were located, they were arrested and charged with Chrissy's murder. And Ferrari would be the first person in Scotland to be charged with a racially motivated murder when it was a white person who was the victim. He would be found guilty on November the 18th of 2004 and he was sentenced to life in prison. And honestly, I wish the death penalty existed at this point. I wish it was still in Britain because if anyone deserves to be executed, it is these 5 men. And then we have Ziggy. Ziggy, who had the 6 p.m. curfew and had to be dropped off early. He admitted to the police that he was involved in the abduction of Kriss, but he confirmed that he had absolutely no involvement in the murder of Kriss. Now, because this man hadn't been there to witness the murder, and because he was agreeing to give evidence on the other 3 killers, he was only sentenced to 5 years in prison and he would only serve 2.5 years. Are you freaking kidding me? Listen, I get it, okay? I know how it works. But this man abducted Kriss, knowing exactly what Baldy and his men wanted to do. Baldy was out for blood. Baldy wanted to murder, and he knew it. He was no innocent bystander when he could have stepped up and told Baldy, calm down, take a break, have a Kit Kat. He never. He encouraged that behaviour and helped find an innocent victim. He should have received a life sentence as well, at the very least. And I hope to God that that man rots in hell. Now, tracking down the other 3 men who had fled to Pakistan, this took quite a while, and especially because there was no extradition treaty. This just made things really difficult. People were having to jump through hoops to try and make deals. It was just a horrendous time. And Chrissy's family started to think that maybe they're never going to get justice for Kriss. Maybe these 3 men will just be allowed to carry on and live their lives in Pakistan. However, a member of Parliament for Glasgow Central, he would step up and he would do everything in his power to get these men extradited back to Britain. And that was Mohammed Sarwar. He appealed to the Pakistan authorities. He told them what they had done to this young boy. And he requested that these men be sent back to face their consequences. And the Pakistan authorities, they agreed. These men would be arrested in Pakistan and extradited back to the UK in July of 2005. Now, once these 3 men arrived back in Scotland, they were of course charged with the murder of Kriss Donald, and they would face trial in October of 2006, 2.5 years after Chrissy's murder. And they all had the absolute cheek to plead not guilty. On November the 6th of 2006, the jury would deliberate for 8.5 hours. And the jury had made a unanimous decision that all 3 of these men were guilty of the murder of Kriss Donald. All 3 of these men would then be served a life sentence, and not a single one of them apologised or showed any remorse for what they had done to this boy. Apologies, I just had to finish my makeup off camera because I realised that I was far ahead in the story and my makeup wasn't as far along as it should have been. But that's not important here. So do you remember how I was telling you that Ziggy, that freak, that he would be released from prison after just 2.5 years? Well, he very quickly jumps in, changes his name to Yusuf Harris, so no one could associate him with the crime. Like, he was really wanting people to not recognise him because he was scared that people might take revenge on Chrissy's behalf and, maybe do the same to him, which I wish they had, but... However, in 2017, this monster, he would be sent back to prison after he threatened to murder someone. And you're telling me that he had no desire to murder Kriss? There he is threatening to murder somebody else. This is why this man should also have been handed a life sentence. And then Crazy, Baldy's brother, he had to be moved prison numerous times because so many inmates were targeting him for what he had done to Kriss, and they were willing to take their own revenge on him. But of course he was protected because the prison system can't allow that to happen, unfortunately, so he was moved around every time he became like a target. Ferrari, he had actually received an additional 6 years on his sentence in 2015 because he had admitted to lying and obstructing justice. And then we have Big Baldy, the weirdo. When he was in prison, he literally still thought he was the bee's boss. He thought he could be a big bully, but what he didn't realise is that he was a small fish put into the ocean, not even a big pond, into the ocean, because he was in prison with men much bigger, much more terrifying than him. In 2013, he was almost killed by other inmates when he was working out in the gym, working on his bodybuilding. He was attacked with metal bars from the weights, 33-pound dumbbells were smashed into his head, his cheekbones, his jaw and his teeth, all completely shattered. And then in 2022, Baldy, he actually slashed his own throat, and very, very sadly, he would survive. Now, he said the reason he was trying to kill himself is because he thought it would help his family not become targets and get themselves killed. And what's so funny is some of the staff, they had even said that when they seen him in a cell, they really had no desire to help him. They didn't want to see him live, but they had no other choice. I just hope and pray that these men, for the rest of their natural lives and for all eternity, I hope they spend it in hell. I hope they're tortured in the most brutal ways. and I hope they feel the pain that they inflicted on Kriss Donald that day. And this video today is of course dedicated to Kriss Donald, his family, his friends, his community, the people who all loved and adored him. This is for them. Kriss was a young boy who was loved and adored by so many, and his life was just brutally taken away from him by these evil monsters. This was a young boy who could have done so much in his life, who could have done so much good and achieved so much, and never got the opportunity. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. So Archibald Thomas Hall, he was born on June the 17th of 1924, and he was born to his parents Mary Hall and Archibald Hall Sr. in Glasgow, Scotland. I promised you a Scottish case, and I'm bringing it. So Archibald Hall, he also had Archibald? Are you kidding? Archibald. I might just call him Archie. I'm getting worried that I'm going to keep calling him Archibald, so I'm just going to call him Archie just to, eradicate that option. So Archie, he had a half-brother and his name was Donald Hall. There isn't a lot of information regarding their relationship or their closeness growing up, but we are going to come back to Donald anyway. He's not the best, but we'll get there when we get there. But all you need to know at the moment is that he has a brother called Donald Hall, and he's not a great guy either. So Archie's parents, Mary and Archibald Sr., they were quite a successful pair, to be honest. Like, he was born into a respectable family, but honestly, he fell short of his family's expectations. Like, they expected him to be something incredible, someone to be proud of, and in their eyes, he wasn't. He did seem to have a really strange relationship with both his parents, but in particular his father. Like, his father was very much like a man's man, and Archie wasn't. Like, sometimes he just wanted to relax and just chill out, but Archibald Sr. was constantly like, let's go chop some logs, let's cut down a tree, like just very manly activities, and Archie's just like, no. So it becomes very apparent to Archie sometime in his teen years that his parents just can't stand him. Like, they don't want to be around them, and to be honest, he doesn't really want to be around them because he is just constantly met with this like feeling of disdain from his own parents, which is horrible. So once Archie has it clear in his mind that his parents can't really stand him and that he falls short of their expectations anyway, this is when he decides that he's going to start acting out, like many children do. Like, that's not unheard of. I've had my fair share of acting out. Sorry, mum and dad, but I have. But his way of acting out wasn't, not abiding to the rules or just doing things to irritate his parents. His way of acting out was by turning to a life of crime. And let's just say he was an active criminal in his teen years, and then for the rest of his years he was active, and by the age of 15 he had really went into the world of work as a petty theft criminal. Like, Archie had aspirations, they just weren't the aspirations other people hoped he would have. So Archie gets to a point by the time he is 15 and he decides that there is no point in trying to live the sort of life that his parents want him to live because, well, it's not really working out for him. So at the age of 15, he leaves the family home and he would just live out his life of crime, just the way he wanted it. And from a very young age, Archie had developed this skill of being able to fake confidence to the extreme. Like, he seemed like a really personable, extroverted person who people would gravitate toward. And with this, like, confidence and this arrogance that he had about him, it made his lies very believable when he would tell them. And so many people believed that he was a member of the aristocracy. Aristocracy? I'm trying to think of the aristocrats. But he's posing as a member of one of them, the aristocrats, and he's also saying he's like a wealthy American, so he's even like changing his voice. And in some cases he wouldn't even change his voice, so he's like, yeah, I'm a wealthy American, speaking full Scottish. That's a bit of a loophole in his plan. So in his later teen years, around the age of 17, a neighbour of Archie's, he had initiated a sexual relationship with this young boy. Of course, it's completely illegal and completely gross that this full-grown ass man is going after Archie, who's only 17. But Archibald would later say that, I just called him Archibald again, but Archie would later say that this sexual relationship that he had really helped him accept his sexuality, and he discovered quite early on that he was in fact bisexual. And he was very open about this, very open-minded. He never really hid it from anyone, which his dad absolutely hated. Because in his dad's eyes, a bisexual or gay man was not a manly man, which is honestly just so ridiculous. Now, not only did this man help Archie identify his true sexuality, this man also opened him up to a very sophisticated lifestyle and gave him a taste of the high life. And Archie from that day forward realised that's the sort of life he wants to live all the time, no matter what the cost. So he starts off as a petty thief, you know, just the odd thing here and there, pickpocketing, whatever. And then very quickly, he graduates into house breakings. And it wouldn't just be normal houses, it would be big houses that he would target. And his main goal when breaking into these houses was to steal very expensive, valuable jewellery. And he was quite successful in doing this. The guy just seemed to have some sort of obsession with anything that glimmered in the light, anything shiny, he wanted his hands on it. So Archie, he is breaking into houses left, right and centre. Doesn't matter if you've got an alarm, doesn't matter if you've got a guard dog, he is still going to break into your house. And he's able to steal an insane amount of expensive jewellery. And what he would do is he'd start his own little side hustle of selling the jewellery that he had stolen from these people, making his own money, and then saving that so he could move to a nice area in London.
London, baby!
So he's making a good profit. He's pretty proud of himself. You know, the side hustle's going well when you rob people and just sell their stuff on. Easy money. And then back in this time when Archie had moved to London,
That's London, baby!
there was like a development within the gay scene, and this was sort of expanding as time was going on. And Archie, he made the most of the gay scene. He was a big fan of the gay scene. You couldn't really get him away from the gay scene. He could not get enough of the PP. The only problem that Archie would incur is the fact that the very thing that was allowing him to live this very lavish, wild lifestyle would also be the very thing that put him behind bars. At just the age of 17, Archie, he would be arrested and charged for trying to sell the jewellery that he had stolen in Scotland to people living in London.
Let's do it! Yeah, cheerio! London, baby!
But people had just caught on to him so quick because where was he getting the jewellery from? And why was he so eager to sell it for money? Like, if you had that money and had that jewellery, you wouldn't really care about selling it. So people could tell right away that this man was not old money or new money, he was just stolen money. Can you hear my boyfriend singing downstairs? He's been shouting at the football. Live with a boy, they said. It would be fun, they said. Help. So with this, Archie has wound up in prison for the very first time. Not his last time though, he was quite the regular in prison. We'll hear more of that. But during his first time in prison, he put his time to good use because, I mean, all you've really got is time, haven't you? So whilst he's in prison, he dedicated a lot of his time to learning about antiques. He also spent a lot of his time learning about the aristocracy, the aristocrats. And not only this, but he had taken elocution lessons so he could soften or sort of get rid of his Scottish accent. I'm offended, sir. Now, you might be thinking, like I was thinking when I first read this case, why is young Archibald doing the absolute most? Well, Archie, whatever, he had decided that upon his release from prison, he wanted to be a new and improved man, which sounds great. But the reason he wanted to be a new and improved man was because he knew that he only planned on mingling with the high flyers, the rich, the famous. He wasn't going to mingle with the sorry people like me. And not only did he just want to mingle with these people, but they were also his target audience when it came to thieving. He knew that if he could mingle with the upscale, the high flyers, the rich, the famous and whoever, that he would be able to steal antiques and jewellery and be able to fund his lavish lifestyle that he became accustomed to through thievery. So Archibald, he gets released from prison and he decides, you know what, new year, new me, like I want a change of scenery, I want a change of identity, and unlike you and me who would probably go out get a new haircut, he decides that he's changing everything, and this included his own name. Archibald Hall it wasn't cutting it for him, and he wanted something a bit zazzier and cooler and more upscale. He needed a name to fit the lifestyle, so he's looking around, he's gathering inspiration, and this is when he would decide to call himself Roy Fontaine. And if you haven't already caught on, he had decided to go by this name when he was inspired by Joan Fontaine, who starred in the Alfred Hitchcock film Rebecca. He was like, I want to be like Joan. Joan sounds great, but I don't want to be Joan, I'll need to be someone else, so I'll be Roy Fontaine. People might think we're related. So as you can tell, the man's clearly aiming for the top and, thinks that he can fool everyone. Actually kinda does for a while, so I guess it works. So Archie, Archibald, Roy Fontaine, Roy, he is feeling on top of the world. He is like, wow, brand new identity, brand new me, my soul has been cleansed, I'm so ready for whatever this year has to offer. Archie or Roy or whatever we're calling him at this point, he is able to find himself a woman. So he dates this woman for a while and they eventually get married. Now he had said whilst he was in this relationship that he was able to be openly bisexual. He was having a lot of affairs with other men and his wife was the only woman that he was seeing. And whilst his wife might be up for this at first, over time she's like, do you know what, I'm a one man kind of woman and I want a one woman kind of man, but I've got a man who wants a man who also wants a woman who also wants me. There's just too many cooks in the kitchen. So the marriage was extremely short-lived. They get a divorce, break up, call it quits, see you later. But this didn't really upset Archie because according to him, he is schmoozing and banging some of the elite. He says that he has affairs going on with some very, very high-end men. So at first he claims he had an affair with Lord Boothby. He also claimed to have a sexual relationship with a playwright by the name of Terence Rattigan. And despite Archie, Roychard or whatever we're going to call him, having these high-flying romances and sexual relationships with the greatest, he said there was one man in particular who he believed was his true love. And this was a fellow prison mate by the name of David Bernard, who had tragically died in a car accident in 1974. And David Bernard, he was just this regular little guy from Hull. So it just shows you don't need to schmooze and bang whoever's in fashion at the time. Like, normal people deserve to be loved. So little Archie Roy, he's still thieving, he's still got sticky fingers, he's thieving any jewellery piece that he can find, breaking into houses, trying to sell the stolen jewellery. It's all just a bit mental. And of course with that he winds up in and out of prison, which isn't a good look for someone who wants to act like a member of the aristocracy. Although I'm pretty sure there's a few corrupt fellows in the aristocracy. So he is in and out of prison on multiple different occasions, but it would be his most lengthy sentence where he would really work on refining himself, really refining Roy Fontaine. He's like, who is Roy Fontaine? Who do I want Roy Fontaine to be? So, 1975, Archie, Roy, Archibald, whoever, he is finally released from prison, and by this point he had basically eradicated any Scottish element of himself, including a Scottish accent. He eliminated that completely. He had like a standard RP English accent, but then he moved back to Scotland. I know, like that's a lot of work to just move back to Scotland. So he returns to Scotland and he's looking for some work, but he wants good work. He wants work with posh people, of course. So he was able to find a job as a butler working for Margaret Peggy Lady Hudson. Doesn't get much fancier than a lady. Now, Lady Hudson, she was a widower of Sir Austin Hudson, who was a first baronet. So, you know, high-flying family for sure. And not only was he a first baronet, but he was also a Conservative member of Parliament. So Roy, at this point, he hears this and he's like, yes, this is my people. This is where I belong. And so he takes a job and he would work for Lady Hudson. So Lady Hudson, she lived in Kirtleton House of Dumfriesshire in Scotland. And this was a really gorgeous house. Like, you looked at the outside of that house and you just knew there was valuables inside. So I'm sure you can already imagine exactly why Archibald has taken this job with Lady Hudson. He had plans to steal from her, steal her valuables, any antiques, any expensive jewellery, and he was going to sell this on. But there was only a slight issue. He really liked Lady Hudson, and he really liked the job that he was doing. And so he decides pretty early on that he doesn't actually want to steal from her. He doesn't want to do that. And at this point, he's thinking, you know what? Maybe I'm going straight-laced. Maybe I could live an innocent, good, straight-laced life. A good path, a path of honesty. Would he? No. So around the same time, Archie, Roy, he is currently having an on-again and off-again relationship with a woman by the name of Mary Coggle. And remember Mary, she's important, we'll come back to her. Now, Mary Coggle, she was a sex worker and her sort of like nickname was Belfast Mary. No way is Connor just put on a washing when I'm filming. Can you hear that? My floor's vibrating. So at this point, things are going really well for Archibald, Roy Fontaine, whoever he is going by this day. But things are going really well and he's actually enjoying working, he's enjoying spending time with his boss. And then along comes David Wright. Now, he was a fellow conman who Archibald had actually served time with previously, and he was very much into stealing, breaking into houses, all that jazz. I honestly, I don't know how David done it, right? But I still don't really know how Archibald done it either. But somehow David Wright is able to get a job as a gamekeeper on Lady Hudson's estate in 1977. Like, I'm going to assume that, like, criminal records or checking criminal records weren't really a thing back then, because it seems to be very easy to get a job in a very posh house in a posh family when you're a thief. So Archie very quickly finds out from David Wright that the reason David Wright had taken this job at Lady Hudson's estate was because he had the same plan that Archie originally had. He wanted to steal the jewellery, steal any valuables, sell them on, get money, like just completely take advantage of this lady. But Archie likes his job and he doesn't want to do that. And so when he finds out that David Wright had stole like this really expensive bit of jewellery from Lady Hudson, he forces him to return it to her. Now, any other time after this, when David Wright would steal from Lady Hudson, and any time Archibald would go and tell him, like, you can't do this, put it back, David Wright would threaten Archibald. So Archibald says to him, if you don't put it back, I'm going to tell Lady Hudson exactly who you are and what you do, and she will fire your sorry ass in a hot second. But then David Wright comes forward and he's like, well, if you tell Lady Hudson about me, I'm going to tell Lady Hudson about you, because I'm assuming that she doesn't know about your criminal past. And of course she doesn't, because if she did, Archibald would never have been hired. So Archibald hears this, right, and immediately he recoils. He does not want to ruin this really great thing that he's got going here, this really great job and the great boss that he has. So he's like, whoa, like, wait a sec, let's just reverse, back up. Let's not do any of that to each other. And in fact, why don't we take some time out to discuss this together, try and come to some sort of arrangement and come to a very amicable solution. And David Wright says, yeah, that sounds great. I don't want to fight with you, don't want to argue with you, but I'm just being me. I'm here to enjoy myself. But they both agree because they go way back, you know, bros, they serve prison time together, so they don't want to ruin the friendship. So David and Archie, they go out and they decide to go on a rabbit hunt together. This seems like the perfect way to come to an amicable solution. Weapons. So they're making their way out and they are discussing their situation, trying to come to some sort of agreement. And then they sort of enter the middle of the fields. And once you're in the middle of these fields, it's so far away from the house. So from the house, you can't see this area of the fields, which Archibald was very, very aware of. So as soon as they hit the middle of the fields, Archibald, with his gun already loaded, shoots David Wright in the back of the head because he is not having anyone take away this amazing opportunity that he has. So obviously, David Wright, dead, pan-braid dead, it's bad. And then Archie's thinking to himself, oh God, now I've got to try and get rid of his body. So he grabs David Wright, drags him a bit of distance, and then he decides to bury him next to the stream on the Curtleton, can't say it, on the Curtleton house grounds. On the house, like, would you not be better just taking him into the woods at that point? So then, of course, David Wright doesn't turn up for work, and Lady Hudson's thinking, you know, where is David? This is really strange. He's usually here on time, stealing my goods. And Archie, or Roy as she knew him, he says to her, you know, he's a bit of a snake, and he's saying, you know, I'm not surprised that he's not turned up. This is the kind of thing that he's known to do. So he's saying all of this to Lady Hudson, but Lady Hudson just had a slight feeling that something wasn't quite right. So she decides to do a bit of digging herself, and when she digs into David Wright's past, she would find a name and a face. This face looked very familiar, but the name did not, because it looked like Roy Fontaine, but the name given was Archibald Thompson Hall. So she confronts Archibald, Roy, oh, I just threw my brush away, sorry about that, but she confronts Roy, and he is trying to deny, but eventually it's like, oh, you know what, yeah, guilty, it is me, I am Archibald Hall. And immediately, once this is uncovered, Lady Hudson would fire him. So now at this point, now that Archibald's lost, the only job that he's ever liked and the only job he ever wanted to go straight-laced for, he decides that there's no real reason for him to stick around in Scotland. So he would move from Scotland back down to England in November of 1977. But bearing in mind, he's committed a murder. So he makes his way back to London and he decides yet again, I'm just going to find another butler job to the rich or the famous, or the rich and famous if I'm lucky. And this would take us to Richmond Court in Chelsea, which is home to a lot of very, 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 very wealthy people. So we're in Chelsea, home to the rich, and one of the rich that we would find in Richmond Court was a retired Labour MP by the name of Walter Travers Scott Ellis. Now, he was 82 years old and he had his wife Dorothy, who was 60 years old. So she was 22 years younger than him. Now, she was Indian born and she had a lot of very beautiful, stunning Indian antiques. Now, the Scott Ellises, they lived a very quiet life in their beautiful, lavish penthouse, and they were looking for a butler to do the day-to-day work for them. I mean, Mr. Scott Ellis himself, he is quite an age. He just wants to relax and they need to find someone who's going to do the job well and also build a connection with the both of them. So they're on the hunt for their butler, and this is when a man by the name of Roy Fontaine hops up. He's like, hire me, I'm great. He tells them, I already have butler experience, I was a butler in a really large house, I had to do this, that and the next thing. I'm great at the job, you should absolutely hire me. And at this point, Roy Fontaine, Archibald, you know, he's really worked on refining himself over the years, so he comes across very smooth, he looks very polished, he's very well spoken, and they think, yeah, this is the guy that we want, this, hello butler, it's you. So the Scott Ellises, they were very impressed and satisfied with the work that Roy Fontaine was doing around the penthouse apartment, and they really grew to trust him. And they trusted him so much, they would allow him to sign blank cheques on his employer's behalf, which would just not be good in the long run. I mean, that is trust heavily misplaced, and this would be a huge mistake. And just to reiterate, the man that this innocent couple have hired, he's portraying himself as Roy Fontaine, successful, well-mannered, very polished, comes from a good background, is a good person. But actually who they've wound up with is Archibald Hall, an ex-convict, a con man, a jewel thief, and unbeknownst to the Scott Ellises, a cold-blooded murderer. So remember, he has only moved back to London in November of 1977. On December the 8th of 1977, he would meet up with a fellow con man, and this was a man by the name of Michael Keto. And this would be his accomplice in the plan of defrauding the Scott Ellises. So Archibald, he decides to take Michael Keto to the penthouse apartment to look at the antiques, the jewellery, all the things that they're planning to steal. Now, he does it on this day because he believes that Mrs. Scott Ellis, she should be in a nursing home on this day receiving treatment for her arthritis. So in case you can't tell, my makeup's a bit further along than what it was because my camera died and I just kept yapping, not even realising. So here we go. So as I had said, Mrs. Scott Ellis, she was meant to be at the nursing home getting treatment for her arthritis. And then Mr. Scott Ellis, he was supposed to be in his bed sleeping at this point, which he was. Mrs. Scott Ellis, she was not at the nursing home that day. She was actually at home. So once Keto and Hall arrive at the penthouse and they're sort of scoping out the antiques, what they're going to steal, what they're going to leave, whatever, they would find Mrs. Scott Ellis in bed. And of course, there's this stranger in her house. She has no idea who Michael Keto is, and she is immediately alarmed and she wants to know who he is, why he's here, like why is he in her home? And she felt like something was wrong and she wanted to know what it was that they were up to. And disgustingly, Hall and Keto, they knock Mrs. Scott Ellis out of her bed onto the floor and they grab a pillow and they smother her. And they would actually kill her through this smothering. So they've suffocated her to death and they're both shocked. They apparently didn't mean for this to happen. And the reason that's actually believable is because they required Mrs. Scott Ellis's signature for the cheque that they had written to defraud the couple. And now they didn't have that. So Archie, he immediately panics. He's like, oh my God, what have we done? Like, how are we going to cover this up? They both grab Mrs. Scott Ellis and they put her back into her bed in a way that it looks like she's still sleeping. So she's in like a sleeping position. And then it's just so devastating because Mr. Scott Ellis, he has heard his wife scream. He's obviously heard some kind of bang that's woken him up. So he goes through to check on his wife and there's Keto and Hall just standing over her bed. And Archibald Hall would tell him that Mrs. Scott Ellis had a nightmare and that she had a fright, but he's put her back to bed, calmed her down, and she's sleeping again. And Mr. Scott Ellis just goes back to bed thinking that his wife's okay. So the next morning rolls around and Hall and Keto, they meet up with Mary Coggle, Belfast Mary. But to prevent any suspicion from Mr. Scott Ellis, they decide that they're going to double up on his medication, so give a really heavy dose of this medication he takes. So he didn't realise that Mrs. Scott Ellis wasn't Mrs. Scott Ellis. What do I mean by that? Well, Belfast Mary, she puts on a wig. She dresses up in Mrs. Scott Ellis's clothes, putting on her nice fancy mink coat, and she would pretend to be Mrs. Scott Ellis. Now Hall, he tells Mr. Scott Ellis that they're all going to go on a car journey, they're going on a trip, so they get in the back of the car. Keto and Hall, they're in the front, and then there's Belfast Mary and Mr. Scott Ellis in the back, and Mr. Scott Ellis believes that Mary Coggle is his wife. And what he doesn't know is that his wife's dead body is in the boot of the car, the trunk of the car. So they're all in the car and they are driving for ages. Bearing in mind, they've started off in Chelsea in London. So they're all in the car and they start heading north. They stopped overnight in Cumbria so they could rest in a cottage that Archibald Hall had rented using the Scott Ellis's money before then heading to Perth in Scotland. Once they arrive in Perth, they would then bury Mrs. Scott Ellis's dead body in a shallow grave. They just had no care whatsoever for this woman. So they continue north and eventually they come to Glen Affric. Glen Affric, this is in the Scottish Highlands, and when they arrive here, this is where they would murder Mr. Scott Ellis. So at first they are going to strangle him, but Mr. Scott Ellis, he is putting up a fight. He does not want to die and he is adamant to get out of this situation alive. And then they panic because they never expected a struggle. So they then take a shovel and they bludgeon this 82-year-old man to death. And just so you know, at this point, Archibald Hall, he does not care what he's done. Cato doesn't care what he's done. Mary doesn't care what she's been involved with. And they all head off sightseeing. So they go to Inverness, they go to Aviemore, they're making the most of the day. They then go to Perth and they would sell some of the Scott Ellis's antiques and jewels and necklaces, nice jewellery that they had that was worth a lot of money. After Perth, they then head over to Edinburgh and they do the exact same there. So once they have finished selling this dead couple's belongings, they then head back to the cottage in Cumbria and things get a little bit tense. So Mary Coggle, she's wearing the mink coat, this expensive mink coat, and she's kind of claimed it as her own. She's rocking it, thinks she looks great, she wants to keep it. She has no intentions of handing this back. But Archibald Hall, he's saying, you know, this is going to look really weird if you rock up to King's Cross in London wearing this fur coat that you've never had the money to buy before. People are going to get suspicious, so you need to get rid of the fur coat. You can't keep it. Now, David Wright, that he had murdered previously, he hadn't really been identified as a missing person, but Archibald Hall knew right away that the Scott Ellis's, they would be reported missing immediately. If police are in the penthouse, they'll realise that things are missing, including the mink coat, and if they see that mink coat, they're going to know that something's wrong. So Hall, he is saying to Mary Coggle, you know, you need to get rid of that coat, you can't keep it, we need to either like burn it, bury it, something like that. You're going to get us caught if you keep this coat. Mary's fuming. Mary is like, I am not handing over my fur piece. No way. Mary's feeling great. Mary's feeling like a mob wife. She is not willing to give up the mink coat that's not even hers. But because she wasn't willing to give it up, she ultimately seals her own fate. And the men very quickly realise she needs to die. Because that's how they solve their problems. And it's just so disturbing, but they both take large pokers and they beat Mary within an inch of her life and then strangle her to death. So the next day, her body is then put in the boot of the car, just like they had done with the Scott Ellis's. They drive over the Scottish border and then they just throw her body into a stream. So over the next couple of weeks, Hall and Cato, they're still living in this cottage in Cumbria, but they were going back and forth, taking turns going to the Scott Ellis's penthouse to get more antiques, more belongings that they would be able to sell. So then in January of 1978, Donald Hall, remember him, the half-brother? I told you we would come back to him. Well, he was not a great person. He was actually kind of a terrible person. He was in prison for majority of different sex offences and also theft. Apple tree doesn't fall far. And he was very much someone who had no intentions of living a clean, honest life. So when he's released from prison, he gets in contact with Archibald Hall, and Archibald tells him the location of the Cumbria cottage, and Donald makes his way there. And I don't know why he wanted to go see Archie, because Archie hated Donald because of his sex offences, and Donald hated Archie because he was bisexual. Like, they despised each other, so why waste your time? So they're all sitting one day in the Cumbria cottage and they're all having a drink. And when you're drinking and you're already angry with someone, it's really not a good combination. And Archibald feels all of this built up resentment for his brother Donald, just bubbling at the surface. And he decides to tie Donald up. Now at first it's done as like a joke, but that joke wouldn't last very long. So once Donald is tied up, Archibald, he then takes a chloroform soaked cloth, puts this over his brother's mouth until his brother dies. His own brother. And fun fact, well, is it fun because someone just died, but fun fact, this was known to be the first chloroform related murder in Britain, ever. So Hall and Cato, yet again, they've got another body that they need to try and dispose of. So they steal a car, a Ford Granada, but there was one problem with this car. Hall really disliked the number plate on the car, like the registration plate, because it had 999, which in the UK, that's what we would dial to contact the police. And he is not a man of the law. So he ended up fitting this with fake plates, which ultimately would be his downfall. So they've got Donald's body in the car, and they decide they're going to go driving again. So they drive to North Berwick near Edinburgh and they check into the Blenheim House Hotel. Quite a nice establishment because they're still living off the Scott Ellis's money, or the money that they got from selling their belongings. So Hall and Keto, they are drinking at the bar, having a laugh, having a joke, but they're acting very, very, very shady. So shady to the point that the owner of the bar phones the police and says, listen, something's not right, something is going on. I would like you to check up on them. So the police, they request the reg plate of the vehicle that they're driving and also the make and model. So they give the reg plate number to the police and tell them that it's a Ford Granada. However, when the police run the plate, it comes back as a Ford Escort. So how's that? Now, one thing that Hall and Keto did not think about with this vehicle is they might have changed the number plate, but the tax disc in the window still had the original reg plate number with 999. And of course, when the workers say this to the police, they think that it's a stolen vehicle, which it is. So they go over to the Blenheim House Hotel, tongue twister, and they would arrest Keto and Hall. But at this point, they're just suspecting that it's because of the stolen vehicle. They don't know that there's still a body in the trunk. So the police, they get back and they're examining the car, and this is when they open the boot and very quickly realise that there's a body in the back, the body is real, and the body is dead. Now Archibald, thinking that he's all slick, he asks the police if he could go to the bathroom whilst he's in the station, and they allow him, human rights and all that, wouldn't be me. But when he's in the bathroom, he is able to squeeze himself out of this tiny, tiny window and flee the scene. So as soon as he runs out of the police station, he flags down a taxi and he tells the taxi driver, my wife, she's had a really serious accident, like she's in a lot of pain, she's in trouble, I don't know if she's going to be okay, but I don't know what hospital she's been taken to, so can you just drive me to every hospital that we possibly can? And this poor taxi driver, he's thinking that this man's wife might die, so he drives him around for around 3 hours. Now the police, they're scouring the area, they've put out the, like an APB or whatever it is, and they've said, we're looking for this man, he's a murderer, he's not a good guy, be on the lookout. They set up roadblocks, and this taxi, whilst it's driving about, comes to one of said roadblocks. And the police, they are examining and checking vehicles for this convict, and when they check the taxi, they would find Archibald Hall in the backseat. So from there, Hall is arrested and he's taken back into custody, but not before paying the taxi driver the entirety of the taxi fare. Don't say he's a man that doesn't have class. So Archibald Hall, he would pay the entirety of the cab fare, which seems like a good deed, but it's not, because it's dead people's money that he's paying it with. So police in London, they had visited the Scott Ellis's apartment penthouse, and they had learned from antique dealers that silverware that was believed to be the Scott Ellis's had been offered for sale. Now both police forces, Scotland and England, they combine forces. They're working together at this point because they want to work out exactly what has happened to this poor couple. And because the whole sequence of events is all unravelling right before them, both of the men, they are quite honest about what they've done, who they've killed along the way, and they would lead the police to the graves of their victims. Now, when Archibald Hall was asked about the murders, he had said, I can't feel anything for killing these 5 people. Not even remorse. And not only this, but police, they weren't even aware of David Wright's murder. Archibald just offers it up. Silver platter, there you go, there's another one. So both Hall and Keto, they would appear in front of the Scottish court system as well as the English court system, because the murders had taken place in both Scotland and England, and both of them were served life sentences. Now, because Hall was the leader and he seemed to be more cold-blooded than Keto, he was told that he would never have a chance for parole for the rest of his natural life. So he'd be in prison forever. So then in 2002 in Kingston Prison in Portsmouth, at the age of 78 years old, Archibald Hall would die from a stroke. And honestly, I'm not mad about it. I'm not sad about it. I'm quite happy about it. I am filming this case at 6:30 in the morning. which is why I look tired. Because I am. It's really weird, right? Because Christie Cleek is meant to be more like notorious than Sawney Bean, and yet there's not much details on Christie Cleek's early life, whereas Sawney Bean I was able to get quite a lot of detail on. But what we do know is Christie Cleek was originally born Andrew Christie in Perth of Scotland, and it is said that he was either born at the very end of the 13th century or the very start of the 14th. So again, I'm not sure. So like I said, he was born in Perth of Scotland, and he was born to a family that didn't really have much in the way of possessions or wealth, but at this point in time it's quite common. I mean, there's not really much going about. But Christie Cleek, he decided that he wanted to make a better life for him and his family, so he decided to train as a butcher. Now, this is obviously a really good trade to have back then, and it is one that he believed would be in demand, and it should have been, but it wouldn't have been. My eyebrow pencil that I got sent like 2 weeks ago broke. So, during the 1340s, the Perth butcher would fall on some really, really hard times. It was the time of Scottish famine, and it was widespread. And I mean, like, how can you be a butcher if you've no meat to be butchered? How can you be a butcher if there's nothing to cut up? Now, this case of famine in Scotland, of course, meant that there was widespread hunger, malnutrition. There was like no food supply to go around, so everyone was just like skinny queens, but no because they wanted to be. And like, famine can happen for a majority of reasons, whether it's crop failing, like extreme weather conditions, or of course like war and economic instability. Now, with famine, this was causing families and even entire communities to completely suffer. And honestly, there would be devastating consequences to their health, their livelihoods, and even their social stability. Famine was one of the most devastating things to go through, and not only would adults die, there was children dying, there was babies. It was truly such a devastating time. Like, not only was his work suffering, but his family was also suffering. I mean, now at this point, he could not provide for his family at all. They were all starving, and he had to come up with a new way to, get business booming and their stomachs full. So, Christie Cleek, right? He's not really able to come up with his own ideas. So he's like, what I'm going to do is like put some feelers out in the community, see if anybody else has ideas, because why think of my own when I can have other people think for me? So he wanted to go out to the community and ask if they had any ideas on how they could tackle this famine, because he's starving. Now, Christie Cleek, Andrew Christie, Mr. Popular. He's able to put together this large group of locals, and this group of locals I can only describe as a group of absolute savages, but he gathers this group of locals and they decide that they're going to take to the Grampian Mountains. And the Grampian Mountains, they are one of 3 major mountain ranges in Scotland, and it stretches across like a huge portion of the Scottish Highlands. Now, in these mountains there's like rivers, there's streams, so there might be a few fish. They might have fish and chips for dinner. And also in the Grampians, there should be a few animals. Hearing there might be a few animals makes the butcher very happy. Now, you might wonder, Anna, why is this large group so excited and so keen to go to the Grampian Mountains? Are they there for the scenery? No. Were they running away from home and their troubles? No. Were they taking a trip? Also no. Or are they just wanting to go fishing? Now, if you think it's the last one, you're close, but not really. So the reason that this group was so willing to go up to the Grampian Mountains is because they got intel, secret intel, that the Grampian Mountains was home to a huge range of wildlife. So there was like red deer, there was eagles, there was mountain hare, and a ton of bird species, right? And to them, this is like their local Tesco or Waitrose or wherever you shop, M&S. So Christie and his group, they had really high hopes that if they took to the Grampian Mountains, they would be able to hunt a lot of the local wildlife, and they would A, be able to feed their families, B, be able to feed themselves, and C, Christie could get his butcher trade back up and running because he can just take like the deer home, butcher them, and then sell them. It's a win-win. Make money. So the group have headed out and they are trying their best to scavenge, find some wildlife to hunt. And to start with, they're really just not having much luck. They're having trouble locating wildlife, and then any wildlife that they seem to encounter, they're actually failing to kill. And climbing these mountains, it was no picnic, okay? And it was tiring, it was exhausting, it took up a lot of energy, and this was energy that they just did not have because they weren't eating properly. Not only that, but they are hiking in Scotland, and we know what Scotland's weather's like. They were really fighting against the elements. So one day whilst they are hunting, one of the scavengers collapsed, right? And unfortunately, they would eventually wind up passing away from exposure, which to be expected in the kind of elements that they were facing. Now, instead of the group being heartbroken that their scavenging friend had died, they're all kind of giving each other the side eye. They're kind of like, kind of hinting that there's meat lying right there, going to waste. We should do something about that meat. So instead of them viewing him as a friend that they've lost and who's passed away, they could just see meat lying in front of them. And they were starving. So Christie Cleek, he realises this is my time to shine, and he starts to get to work immediately, once again embracing his skills as a butcher. So he starts to dismember the member of the group and begins to butcher away at him. Now, for this, Christie would use his hook as well as his bare hands. So he cooked up their friend. I mean, was he a friend? I'm not even sure at this point, but he cooked them up and then fed him to the group of scavengers. And when they tasted, how good the meat was, the human meat, something clicked. They realised that they wouldn't actually have to starve if they would just ambush other humans who were climbing up the Grampians for food, and they could murder them, butcher them, and eat them. They'll never starve again. And what had started off as a tale of complete desperation and a means of survival for this group soon turned into a very enjoyable activity, especially for Christie Cleek. It could be said that Christie Cleek enjoyed the killing aspect more than the eating aspect. And this would result in a huge bloodbath of travellers throughout the Grampian Mountains because this group had now developed a taste for human flesh and the occasional horse. Now, I'm sure you could already guess, but Christie Cleek, he would become the leader of this murderous clan that he's put together, and honestly his followers were more than happy to join in. It's not like Christie Cleek was forcing them to be there, they chose to be there. And this gang of cannibals, they would set up base in the Grampian Mountains and they would wait for any travellers to pass through because they knew that a lot of locals were going up to the Grampian Mountains to find food sources so they could feed their families. But these people who would go up the mountains wouldn't return. Now, Cleek and his gang, they would hunt through the Grampian Mountains, but this time they weren't hunting for animals, at least not specifically. They were hunting for humans to feed on. Now, when this cannibal group seen people travelling through the mountains, they would hide so they could ambush them. So they would hide in trees, behind bushes, behind rock formations, and then when the time was right, they would jump out and attack them. So Christie Cleek, his favourite method of capturing his meat was using a shepherd's hook. So this was like a wooden stick with a metal hook on the end. And these are also known as a cleek, which is why he got called Christie Cleek. Now, Christie was known to use this hook to rip the victims from their horses or to sweep them off their feet, and not in the romantic way. Now, once the victims had been ripped from their horses, Christie Cleek would use his hook to drag the victim, and then the large group, they would pop out and grab the horse. Now, Christie Cleek, whilst he's dragging these victims back, they would still be attached to the hook, and he would be dragging them over like really rough terrain, like really rough rocks, injuring them along the way. Like, I'm not being funny, could you imagine being dragged on a hook? There's a scene like that in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like the 2005 one, or the one with Jordana Brewster, and her friend gets hooked in the chest and then dragged along, and it always makes my blood go cold. And of course, whilst these people are being dragged by the hook across this terrain, knowing that it's not going to end well for them, they're crying out in agony and terror. But the Cleeks just don't care. And of course, with Christie being the skilled, trained butcher that he was the nominated dismemberer of the group. And it is said that Christie, he would hack off the limbs of their victims whilst they were still alive. And the rest of this cannibal group, they're grown impatient, they're starving, they really want something to eat. And they would start biting into the alive victim. They're alive at this point. They would bite into their raw flesh and just use their teeth to tear off pieces of meat. And they would continue to feast on their flesh whilst Christie was dismembering them. And like, I do have to ask, right? Can you get salmonella from raw human flesh the way that you would get it from raw chicken? Is that a silly question? Maybe, but I wouldn't have thought it was much difference. And I will say, Christie Cleek, he was pretty inclusive with his victim choice. It didn't matter if you were old, young, a child, a baby, black, white, gay, straight, didn't care. All the meat was the same to him. And if you were alive, you were going to be eaten. And it is also said with Christie Cleek that he would cook up the victim's flesh, feed it to their own horse, before then killing the horse and eating the horse as well. Like, it's just, they're such sickos. And people in the town, they started noticing that a lot of the locals that were heading up to the Grampian Mountains would not return, right? Like, they just seemed to go missing without a trace. And what would strike them as very weird is that Christie Cleek and his Cleek clan, they would all return without any trouble. So they would go to Christie Cleek and his clan and ask, you know, did you see Jamie up the Grampians? And Christie would be like, no, never seen him, never seen his horse. Yeah, no, I've not seen him. All the while, he's like burping because he's bringing up Jamie. Like, Jamie's in his stomach, and he's like, no, I've not seen him. I think you have. But it would not be long before the locals heard what the Christie Cleek clan, that is a tongue twister, what the Christie Cleek clan were getting up to in the Grampians. And like, obviously, these locals are getting so concerned when their loved ones are heading up the Grampians and no returning. So a small group of locals, they decided that they were going to head up the Grampian Mountains and they were just going to see if they could find their loved ones, or, you know, in the worst circumstances, their loved ones' bodies or their horses that they had went up on. But of course, they wouldn't find anything. However, what they would find is Christie Cleek and his evil clan feasting on human flesh. They seen them feasting on a human body. And of course, because they hadn't been seen by Cleek and his clan, they rush back to the town to tell the locals exactly what's going on in the Grampian Mountains. Once the group of locals got back to town, they proceed to tell everyone what it is that they've witnessed, and then they tell the Perth Armed Forces. Now, as soon as the Perth Armed Forces hear about this, they get a big group of them together and they storm toward the Grampian Mountains, where they plan to confront and capture Cleek and his clan. Most of this cannibal clan would be caught, but Christie Cleek and a few of his closest members, they would evade capture. How? I don't know. Maybe they hid in a tree, maybe they hid behind a bush, maybe they just disappeared, I don't know, but they never got caught. The members of the clan who had been captured, they of course would be executed. A lot of them were either hung or dismembered and left to bleed out. Some were decapitated and others were burned alive. Like, I don't know if they thought it was like witchcraft going on, but they were like, let's just mix it up. Let's just do a wee bit of everything. Christie Cleek, he would never ever be caught. And it's actually said that he changed his name to David Maxwell. He kind of altered his appearance a bit. And somehow he integrated himself back into society. Him, his wife and his children had moved to Dumfries. It's kind of crazy to me, right? Because obviously him and his family have moved to Dumfries, right? He's changed his name to David Maxwell. People know his name's David Maxwell. Why are we not just like arresting him? There's not going to be an extradition law between Perth and Dumfries. It's literally up the road. However, whilst I was thinking that, I did find out something else, which was that David had went through life claiming that his brother had actually been a victim of Christie Cleek. However, at the end of his life, he would make a deathbed confession, and he confirmed that his brother had in fact been one of the Christies, and he was in fact Christie Cleek. Crazy.